Buddhism Plain and Simple by Steve Hagen. Read by the author. As the current millennium comes to a close, most of us have lost faith in our ancient storybook versions of the world. With the development of science, many of us have come to see the universe as an inconceivably strange, vast, complex, impersonal, multidimensional, and perhaps meaningless realm of mind and matter. Many of us act as though we could find fulfillment if only we possessed enough money, enough security, enough respect, enough love, enough faith, enough education, enough power, enough peace, enough knowledge, enough something. There are others among us, however, who don't or can't buy into this. They sense that real security is impossible to attain, for they know that even if we could manage to accumulate all we desire, it will be inevitably taken from us by death. Our mortality looms above us, as terrifying as it is certain. We seem utterly stumped. How can we possibly find peace under these conditions? There is a way to move beyond this ignorance, pessimism, and confusion, and to experience, rather than comprehend, reality as a whole. This experience is not based on any conception or belief. It is direct perception itself. It's seeing before signs appear, before ideas sprout, before falling into thought. It's called enlightenment. It's nothing more or less than seeing things as they are, rather than as we wish or believe them to be. This liberation of mind, this direct awareness of reality as a whole, is fully accessible to anyone willing to attend to their actual experience. The observations and insights of the Buddha are plain, practical, and eminently down to earth. They deal exclusively with here and now, not with theory, speculation, or belief in some far-off time or place. Because these teachings remain focused on this moment, even as you listen to this, they remain relevant and of profound value to every culture and every person who investigates them seriously. For people investigating Buddhism for the first time, Buddhism Plain and Simple offers a clear, straightforward look at the wisdom and guidance of an enlightened teacher who lived some 2,500 years ago, but whose teachings remain as vital and penetrating today as ever. For people already familiar with Buddhism, including longtime practitioners, this recording provides a long-needed overview of Buddhism's essentials, free of the fetters and cultural trappings that have accumulated over 25 centuries. For every person with a desire to see deeply into the nature of existence, it is a call to awakening. The man known as the Buddha lived in northern India, what is present-day Nepal, in the 6th century BCE. Originally named Gautama, he was the only son of a wealthy king who ruled a small country. As a boy and adolescent, Gautama lived a pampered and sheltered life in his father's palace. His father made sure that Gautama received the best of everything, the finest clothes, the best education, and plenty of servants to do his bidding. Gautama's life was so sheltered, in fact, that he knew nothing of sickness, death, or human suffering until, as a young adult, he heard about death from a servant. Suddenly, for the first time, he was confronted with the reality that human life inevitably entails illness, old age, and death. He was unable to deny or put aside this newfound knowledge, which soon began to trouble him more and more. What was the point of human life, he asked himself, if it was so transient, so uncertain, and so filled with suffering? The question haunted him until he could no longer enjoy the passing pleasures of his life of luxury. He decided to leave his family's home and relinquish his chance to become king. For he had come to see power and wealth as a veneer over a life that had sorrow and loss at its foundation. He chose instead to devote his time and energy to finding a way to extricate himself from this universal despair that seemed to form the very ground of human existence. For 6 years he wandered the valley of the Ganges River, learning the various systems and practices of the great religious teachers of his day. Though he was a good student who quickly mastered whatever he was taught, he found nothing in these teachings and practices that satisfied him, nothing that dispelled the deep sorrow that filled his heart and mind. So he left the teachers and went his own way. And then, while seated under a tree, Gautama experienced enlightenment. At last he thoroughly understood the human problem, its origin, its ramifications, and its solution. From then on he was known as the Buddha, which means the Awakened One. For the next 45 years he taught the way of enlightenment to men and women, nobles and peasants, the learned and the illiterate, the moral and the base, without making the slightest distinction among them. His teaching of liberation from human suffering and despair is universal, and to this day it remains open to anyone who examines it, understands it, and puts it to the test. The Buddha never considered himself to be something other than a human being, only someone who was fully awake. He never claimed to be a god, or to be inspired by God, or to have access to any occult or supernatural power. He attributed his realization and understanding solely to human endeavor and human ability. We call Gautama the Buddha, but many other Buddhas, many other awakened human beings exist and have existed, and every Buddha, past, present, and future, is a human being, not a god. Buddha is not someone you pray to or try to get something from, nor is a Buddha someone you bow down to. A Buddha is simply a person who is awake, nothing more or less. Buddhism is not a belief system. It's not about accepting certain tenets or believing a set of claims or principles. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's about examining the world clearly and carefully, about testing everything and every idea. Buddhism is about seeing. It's about knowing rather than believing or hoping or wishing. It's also about not being afraid to examine anything and everything, including our own personal agendas. Not least of all, of course, we must examine the Buddha's teaching itself. The Buddha himself invited people on all occasions to test him. "Don't believe me because you see me as your teacher," he said. "Don't believe me because others do. Don't believe anything because you've read it in a book either. Don't put your faith in reports or tradition or hearsay or the authority of religious leaders or texts. Don't rely on mere logic or inference or appearances or speculation." The Buddha repeatedly emphasized the impossibility of ever arriving at truth by giving up your own authority and following the lights of others. Such a path will lead only to an opinion, whether your own or someone else's. The Buddha encouraged people to know for yourselves that certain things are unwholesome and wrong, and when you do, then give them up. And when you know for yourselves that certain things are wholesome and good, then accept them and follow them. The message is always to examine and see for yourself. When you see for yourself what is true, and that's really the only way that you can genuinely know anything, then embrace it. Until then, just suspend judgment and criticism. The point of Buddhism is to just see. That's all. We cannot approach Buddhism or begin any real inquiry into truth with any assumption or belief whatsoever. We must be willing to see things as they are, rather than as we hope, wish, or expect them to be. Authentic Buddhism, therefore, begins with fact. It starts with perception, direct experience. Real Buddhism is not really an ism. It's a process, an awareness, an openness, a spirit of inquiry, not a belief system, or even, as we normally understand it, a religion. It is more accurate to call it the teaching of the awakened, or the Buddha Dharma. The teaching of the Buddha does not take what is set down in writing too seriously. Buddhist writings can be likened to a raft. A raft is a very handy thing to carry you across the water from one shore to another. But once you've reached the other shore, you no longer need the raft. Indeed, if you wish to continue your journey beyond the shore, you must leave the raft behind. Our problem is that we tend to fall in love with the raft. Before long we think, "This has been a very good raft. It has served me well. I want to hang on to it and take it with me as I continue my journey." But if we hang on to Buddhist teachings, or any teachings, they will ultimately become a hindrance. Buddhist teachings and writings can assist you, but you won't find truth in them, as if truth somehow resided in the Buddha's words. No words, Buddha's, mine, or anyone else's, can see for you. You must do that for yourself, as Buddha did, while seated under a tree 100 generations ago. Buddhism is sometimes called a non-historical religion. In other words, it doesn't tell a story of creation or speculate that we're heading toward a heaven or afterlife of some kind. Indeed, the Buddha Dharma does not speak of beginnings or ends at all. It's more a religion of middles. In fact, it is often called the middle way. The Buddha Dharma would have you start with what is given in your direct experience. It will not ask you to accept a belief or to attempt to account for some presumed or imagined thing. The Buddha Dharma does not ask you to accept particular explanations of how things are. Truth does not need any explanation. It only needs to be seen. The Buddha said that the human condition is like that of a person shot with an arrow. It is both painful and urgent, but instead of getting immediate help for our affliction, we ask for details about the bow from which the arrow was shot. We ask who made the arrow. We want to know about the appearance and background of the person who strung the bow. We ask about many things, inconsequential things, while overlooking our immediate problem. We ask about origins and ends, but we leave this moment forgotten. We leave it forgotten, even though we live in it. We must first learn how to journey into now. Imagine that you see people seated at a sumptuous banquet. Long tables are piled high with delicacies and spread out before them. A dazzling and mouth-watering array of foods, perfectly prepared, is steaming and glistening and sizzling right in front of their eyes, easily within reach. But the people seated at this feast aren't eating. In fact, their plates are empty. They haven't helped themselves to so much as a crumb. They've been seated at this banquet for a long time now, and they're slowly and steadily starving to death. They're starving not because they can't partake of the wonderful feast, or because eating is forbidden, or difficult, or harmful. They're starving because they don't realize that food is what they need. They don't recognize the sharp, urgent pains in their stomachs as hunger. They don't see that what they need to do, all they need to do, is enjoy the feast that's right in front of them. This is our basic human situation. Most of us sense that something is amiss with our lives, but we haven't any idea what our problem really is, or what we should do about it. We may see, perhaps dimly, that the food is there before us, but we don't connect it to the pain inside us, even as that pain grows sharper and more fierce. We long for something. We feel pain and loss. We suffer. Everything we need to alleviate this dissatisfaction is right here before us, yet we don't realize it. According to the Buddha Dharma, this sad state of affairs, this profound and ongoing dissatisfaction, is the first truth of existence. All the pain we bring to ourselves and others, the hatred, the warring, the groveling, the manipulation, is our own doing. It comes out of our own hearts and minds, out of our own confusion. There is an old story about a man who came to see the Buddha because he had heard that the Buddha was a great teacher. Like all of us, he had some problems in his life, and he thought the Buddha might be able to help him straighten them out. He told the Buddha that he was a farmer. "I like farming," he said, "but sometimes it doesn't rain enough, and my crops fail. Last year we nearly starved. And sometimes it rains too much, so my yields aren't what I'd like them to be." The Buddha patiently listened to the man. "I'm married too," said the man. "She's a good wife. I love her, in fact. But sometimes she nags me too much, and sometimes I get tired of her." The Buddha listened quietly. "I have kids," said the man. "Good kids, too. But sometimes they don't show me enough respect. And sometimes—" The man went on like this, laying out all his difficulties and worries. Finally he wound down and waited for the Buddha to say the words that would put everything right for him. Instead, the Buddha said, "I can't help you." "What do you mean?" said the astonished man. "Everybody's got problems," said the Buddha. "In fact, we've all got 83 problems, each one of us. 83 problems, and there's nothing you can do about it. If you work really hard on one of them, maybe you can fix it. But if you do, another one will pop right into its place. For example, you're going to lose your loved ones eventually, and you're going to die someday. Now there's a problem, and there's nothing you or I or anyone else can do about it. The man became furious. "I thought you were a great teacher," he shouted. "I thought you could help me. What good is your teaching then?" The Buddha said, "Well, maybe it'll help you with the 84th problem." "The 84th problem?" said the man. "What's the 84th problem?" Said the Buddha, "That you want not to have any problems." We think we have to deal with our problems in a way that exterminates them, that distorts or denies their reality. But in doing so, we try to make reality into something other than what it is. We try to rearrange and manipulate the world so that dogs will never bite, accidents will never happen, and the people we care about will never die. Even on the surface, the futility of such efforts should be obvious. Human life is characterized by dissatisfaction. It's right here with us. This is the Buddha Dharma's first truth of human life. How do we deal with this reality? Should we pretend or hope that what we love is not going to die? The awakened would answer with a decisive no. The Buddha Dharma is grounded in reality. It's not pie in the sky or wishful thinking or a denial of what human life is. There's no attempt to cover up, to gloss over, to reinterpret the facts. It's imperative to recognize that our dissatisfaction originates within us. It arises out of our own ignorance, out of our blindness to what our situation actually is, out of our wanting reality to be something other than what it is. Our longing, our craving, our thirsting for something other than reality is what dissatisfies us. The second truth of the Buddha Dharma, then, is that this dissatisfaction arises within us. The third truth is that we can realize the origin of our dissatisfaction and can thus put an end to its most profound and existential forms. The fourth truth, which I will take up shortly, offers us a means to experience just such a realization. This realization is sometimes called nirvana, or enlightenment. A more accurate description, however, might simply be freedom of mind. We often cast our spiritual quest, our grappling with fundamental human issues, as a journey. But the kind of journey we'll embark upon now is not a journey in the usual sense of the word. Generally, we think of a journey as involving movement and direction, either going out somewhere into the world, or else leading inward into the self. But in Buddhism, our journey must go nowhere, neither in nor out. Rather, ours is a journey into nearness, into immediacy. Our journey must be to awaken here and now, to awaken to here and now. To be fully alive, we must be fully present. The question is, how do we do it? In order to experience the answer to this question for yourself, you must come to three realizations. First, you must truly realize that life is fleeting. Next, you must understand that you are already complete, worthy, whole. Finally, you must see that you are your own refuge, your own sanctuary, your own salvation. Pick up a flower, a beautiful, living, fresh rose. It smells wonderful. It reveals a lovely rhythm in the swirl of its petals, a rich yet dazzling color, a soft, velvety texture. It moves and delights us. The problem with the rose is that it dies. Its petals fall, it shrivels up. It turns brown and returns to the earth. One solution to this problem is to ignore the real rose and substitute a plastic one that never dies. But is a plastic rose what we want? No, of course not. We want the real rose. We want the one that dies. We want it because it dies, because it's fleeting, because it fades. It's this very quality that makes it precious. This is what we want, what each of us is, a living thing that dies. Your very own body and mind are also precious, because they're just as fleeting. They're changing always, in every moment. In fact, you are nothing but change itself. Like the rose, our bodies and minds are fleeting. Yet we usually want to keep things from changing. We want to preserve things, to hold on to them. As we shall see, this desire to hold on, to somehow stop change in its tracks, is the greatest source of woe and horror and trouble in our lives. You are already in reality, whether you see it or not. Reality is what's here now. Thus you're here now too. You know all this already, from direct experience. You're not separated from reality. It's not out there somewhere, but right here. This provides us with the chance to wake up. You have this chance to wake up right now, in this moment, and in every moment. Thus enlightenment is already yours. Most of us tend to think, and have been taught, that it's the other way around, that we've got to figure something out. But no, we don't need to figure out our own experience. It's already here, firsthand. All you've got to do is stop blocking yourself and get serious about attending to what's going on. You are not lacking a thing. You only need to stop blocking or interpreting your vision. In his final talk before his death, the Buddha said, "Each of you, be a light unto yourself. Betake yourself to no external refuge. Hold fast to the truth. Look not for refuge to anyone beside yourself." You are the final authority, not me, not the Buddha, not the Bible, not the government, not the president, not mom or dad. You. No community of philosophers, scientists, priests, academicians, politicians, or generals, no school, legislature, parliament, or court can bear responsibility for your life, or your words, or your actions. That authority is yours and yours alone. You can neither get rid of it nor escape from it. Of course, you can pretend to give up this ultimate authority, or ignore it, or act as if you haven't got it, or try to give it to someone else. But you haven't really gotten rid of it. You gave your authority to someone else. You chose to deny or ignore that authority. You made the decision to lie to yourself, to pretend that you lack this authority. Far from being a burden, this ultimate authority is actually quite wonderful. It means that you have the power to wake up. You have it now, in your own hands. You don't have to go anywhere else. You can wake up right now, on the spot. You are fully equipped to do this now, in this moment. You already have all the power you'll ever need to realize happiness. In other words, you're fully prepared for anything that might come along. Each of us has the power to simply be what we are, with nothing extra added. Nothing's lacking, nothing's missing. You are supported and sustained right now, even though you may not yet realize it. To completely end your unease of mind, all you need to do is see that there's really nothing out there to get, because already, within this moment, everything is whole and complete. In doing so, you can awaken from the perennial confusion, from the existential angst, from the unanswered question of what life is about. This activity, this seeing, is the fourth truth of the Buddha Dharma. It is a means by which we can experience freedom of mind. The Buddha Dharma's fourth truth contains 8 aspects, which is why it is also called the Eightfold Path. Just what is this path? It is first of all to see what our problem is, and then to resolve to deal with it. In seeing, you will realize that you must live consciously, not for your sake or someone else's sake, or for the sake of some goal or belief or idea, but for the sake of being fully engaged in the moment. Once you see, you will speak, act, and maintain your life in a conscious way. Wise speech, action, and livelihood then follow naturally. These provide the foundation for a morality that actually works. The moral teaching that derives from the Buddha Dharma is not a goody-goody code of behavior, where we pretend virtue, curry favor, or promise to be good so that we can claim a reward at some later date. Rather, sound morality takes place wholly in the moment. It is based on the immediacy of reality, on how we actually live. Our reward is in immediacy, in here and now, not in a never-never land. The Eightfold Path also includes effort, mindfulness, and meditation. But Buddhist meditation is not what many people think of as meditation. It's neither an exercise in relaxation nor a striving toward some special state of mind. This meditation is simply about learning to be here, to be present in each moment, and to notice what's going on. The first of the 4 truths the Buddha described is called dukkha. Dukkha is often translated as suffering, but this only gets at part of what the word means, because pleasure is also a form of dukkha. In Sanskrit, dukkha often stands in opposition to another word, sukha, which means satisfaction. Some people thus translate dukkha as dissatisfaction, but this doesn't quite hit the mark either. Dukkha actually comes from a Sanskrit word that refers to a wheel out of kilter. If we think of this wheel as one that performs some important function, such as a potter's wheel, then the out-of-true wheel creates constant hardship for us every time we try to make a clay vessel. In the Buddha's time, the accompanying image may have been of a cart with an out-of-true wheel being pulled along. You can imagine how uncomfortable it must feel to ride in such a vehicle. The first truth of the Buddha Dharma likens human life to this out-of-kilter wheel. Something basic and important isn't right. It bothers us, makes us unhappy time after time. With each turn of the wheel, each passing day, we experience pain. Of course, there are moments of pleasure, but no matter how hard we try to cultivate pleasure and keep it coming our way, eventually the pleasure recedes and the disturbance and vexation return. Nothing we do can keep them entirely at bay. No matter what we do, our 83 problems remain. What can we do about this? We can begin by seeing clearly and completely just what our problem is. We've all heard the expression, seeing is believing, but the fact is that believing is not true seeing. In fact, they're opposites. Belief is at best an educated, informed conjecture about reality. In contrast, seeing, raw, direct, unadulterated experience, is the direct perception of reality itself. Let's take a quick example. Suppose I were to come up to you, hold out my closed fist, and tell you that I have a jewel in it. Now, I might be lying or I might be telling the truth. Either way, you have little to go on. As long as my hand remains closed, you don't know whether or not I have a jewel in it. The most you can do, given the limited information I've provided, is believe or speculate that I have, or don't have, a jewel inside my fist. Only when I open my fist can you see if there's a jewel in it or not. And once I do open it, the need for, and the usefulness of, belief vanishes. You can see for yourself whether or not there's a jewel, and you can base your actions on what you see, rather than on what you think. So it is with any issue, question, or dilemma. Belief may serve as a useful stopgap measure in the absence of actual experience, but once you see reality, belief becomes unnecessary. Indeed, at this point, it stands in the way of clear, direct perception. We therefore cannot rely on what we merely believe if we wish to see truth in reality. We can only rely on actual perception and direct experience. As long as we remain in our common state of confusion, however, our minds are characterized by vexation, by dukkha. In fact, if we look carefully and seriously at our situation, we'll see that we experience 3 kinds of dukkha. The first kind of dukkha is straightforward pain, both physical and mental. Whether we like it or not, pain is an unavoidable part of our lives. We can dampen it, medicate or anesthetize ourselves against it, take steps to avoid or minimize it, and sometimes we succeed in reducing it. But we cannot entirely escape it. Sooner or later, even if you're perfectly healthy now, you'll get injured, you'll be sick, you'll hurt, you'll die. Physical suffering occurs whenever something is out of kilter in our bodies. Mental suffering arises whenever we feel something is out of kilter in our lives, in others' lives, or in the world in general. Mental suffering takes place when we don't get what we want, or when we're forced to live with and endure what we don't want. The fact is that we can't really turn our heads away from pain. Wherever we turn, it's with us. We have to face it, or we are never going to find our way out of the situation we are in, the situation of dukkha. We can only deal with pain by facing it squarely. The second form of dukkha is change. All aspects of our experience, both physical and mental, are in constant flux and change. Whatever we think, whatever we can point to or look at or talk about, is in constant flux. If we are in our ordinary state of mind, as opposed to an awakened state, this flux registers as dissatisfaction, disturbance, dukkha. And then we magnify our problem by longing to stop that change, to fix things in their places. We attempt this externally through force, control, and manipulation, and we attempt it internally as well by conceptualizing the world. We try to nail everything down, arrange everything in our minds so that we are left with a sense of meaning or purpose or relief. Even if we manage to make our situation comfortable for the moment, it can only be temporary. All circumstances surrounding this momentary situation will inevitably change, and when they do, our momentary pleasure will depart, only to reveal dukkha once again. So long as we remain in our ordinary state of mind, there's no escape from the inevitable dukkha brought about by change. But we tend not to look at this. Instead, we generally try to control and manipulate the world, our lives, our relationships, events, other people. This attempt is the single greatest source of the second type of dukkha. Beyond the dukkha of pain, beyond the dukkha of change, is the dukkha of being. This third form of dukkha is much harder to see than the first two. It usually requires some serious contemplation. As long as you see yourself as a distinct, separate entity, you must also see yourself as subject to death. If your existence is in being, then you must inevitably pass out of existence. This realization carries with it profound pain, distress, or horror. The simplest way to experience this form of dukkha is just to sit quietly and reflect on the fact that you do not know the answers to some very basic questions. How did you get here? What are you? Where did you come from? Where are you going? You may have beliefs and ideas about these questions, but you do not know the answers to any of them through your own direct experience. Look at how vast the world is. Is there some purpose to all of it? Look at how insignificant each one of us is against this vastness. What is human life for? Why does any of this exist at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? And then there's the big unanswered question. What will happen to me after I die? We have all sorts of stories about heaven and hell, about oblivion and nothingness, about coming back and so on. But they are all stories. The teaching of the awakened is not about telling ourselves a story. It's about investigating actual experience. What does actual experience say about the big question? Can we understand anything about where we came from, or where we're going, or why we're here, or what will happen to each of us when we die? Yes, we can. But we cannot get any satisfaction by trying to figure out answers to such questions. However, if you scrutinize your own experience carefully, this profound unease we all experience just by existing can vanish. Through seeing, you can know. The second noble truth of the Buddha Dharma is the arising of dukkha. Dukkha arises from thirst, craving, wanting, trying to get the object of our desire into our hands. This craving or wanting appears in three different forms. First, there is sensual desire. We tend to think that this is purely physical, but it is also mental. Of course, we want comfortable yet stimulating physical sensations, but we also want good intellectual stimulation, good conversation, a balanced emotional life, enjoyable art and entertainment, and so on. Our sensual craving is in fact mostly mental. Our second form of craving is our thirst for existence itself. We don't want to die. We want to somehow persist, live on, forever. But even if we could abandon our thirst for existence, there's still a third form of craving that plagues us, the thirst for non-existence. We want to be released from this world of pain and vexation once and for all. Dukkha arises repeatedly in our hearts and minds as these three forms of craving. When we don't realize that this is so, we forget this moment and get caught up in longing and loathing, desiring some things to come or stay, and others to go. Virtually all the woes of humankind stem from these three forms of craving. Our greatest pains are thus self-inflicted. Name what afflicts you, and you will ultimately find it linked to your craving, your wanting, your desiring. But we tend not to notice this. Basically, we're confused about what we actually want. We don't easily see that all we really want, all any of us want, is simply to be awake. We don't want to be confused. We don't want to go through life in a state of ignorance. but generally we're ignorant even of this. Because we ignore this deep need of the heart, we seek to appease our desire by acquiring and blocking out. We fancy that some combination of money and fame and love and lack of stress will drive away all our woes, but nothing that can be acquired ever does, and we know it. The awakened do not promise that our 83 problems will go away. No, the ups and downs of life remain with life. But in dealing with the 84th problem, in seeing the arising of dukkha, our problems are not exactly problems anymore. My Zen teacher used to tell the story of a fellow who wanted out, not out of life, just out of the Zen monastery where he was living. In Zen monasteries, you must pay constant attention to what you are doing, what you're experiencing from moment to moment. All your activities are prescribed and they're carried out in deliberate stillness. After a time, this can get to you, which is precisely what happened to the fellow in this story. He went to see the master and said, "I can't take this anymore. I want out." The master said, "Okay, then leave." As he started for the door, the teacher said, "That's not your door." "Oh, sorry." The startled fellow looked around and spotted a second door. As he headed for it, the teacher said, "That's not your door." "Oh." He looked around for another door. He could see that behind the teacher was a little door normally used by the teacher's attendant. As he headed for that door, the teacher screamed at him, "That's not your door." Totally bewildered and exasperated, the poor fellow said, "What do you mean? There's no other door. You told me I could leave, but there's no door I can leave by." "If there's no door you can leave by," said the teacher, "then sit down." We can only be here. We can't leave. We're always here. Examine your life and you'll see that this is the case. The master's "sit down" means to start paying attention to what's actually going on, instead of running away from it. This is the only way we'll put an end to our underlying pain and confusion. Good times come and go, and bad times do the same. Still, we spend much of our time and energy trying to get the good times back. We fail to notice that the good time arrives of its own. Likewise, the bad time appears, even though we spend much time and energy trying to keep it at bay. We don't want bad times, of course, but bad times are out of our control as much as good times. The times we don't want will come and go no matter what we do to control the situation. The good times will do the same. Thus, beyond just simply living fully in each moment, we should realize that such control is impossible, a pipe dream. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't set things up for the future. It does mean that we would do well not to become attached to particular outcomes. We do better focusing our effort on being present, rather than on insisting on what the future must be. Breaking the grip of ignorance and craving comes with just seeing, not with doing something particular about it. Once you see, your course of action will naturally follow. Our problem comes from what the Buddha described as inclination of mind. The mind tends to lean in one direction or another, because out of ignorance, it sees something out there, which it then craves. I want that back. I want that now. Or I don't want that anymore. Push it away. Get rid of it. Either way, we define what we want or don't want as something separate from us. In the enlightened mind, the mind of a Buddha, there's no such inclination, no such leaning. On the other hand, our ordinary mind, our conceptual mind, does lean. It's full of picking and choosing, of wanting and craving. Dukkha, suffering and pain, is associated with choice. The more we fail to understand this, the more we'll be caught up in dukkha, and the more we'll not see the subtlety of it. We live in a culture where we're taught to see freedom as the maximization of choice, but this is not true freedom at all. In fact, it's a form of bondage. True freedom doesn't lie in the maximization of choice, but ironically is most easily found in a life where there is little choice. Consider this. Often the more serious the choice, the easier it becomes to make it. I realized this when I had cancer. My doctor wanted to give me chemotherapy, but I was averse to even taking aspirin. The thought of putting those powerful chemicals in my body repelled me thoroughly. Yet I had a massive tumor in my chest, lumps in my neck, tumors in my abdomen. I was underweight and very weak and tired. Without treatment, I had only a few weeks to live, but there was a slim chance I could survive a few months, perhaps even a year or more, with treatments. Though I was repulsed by the thought, the choice was easy. I said yes to the chemotherapy. That was over 20 years ago. This is not to say that freedom of mind is about giving up choice. Choices will always remain in the shifting details and circumstances of our lives. But the fact is, when it comes to freedom of mind, choice is easy. We have no choice but to wake up. When petty choices occupy the mind, necessity is forgotten, and wanting and craving, picking and choosing take over. The mind is ill at ease and dissatisfied for want of the next petty thing. Life and death choices are few and usually easy to make, painful as they may be. Inconsequential choices are not. Yet we needlessly clutter our lives with them. We think they bring us pleasure, but they only breed dissatisfaction. Thus, without realizing what we're actually doing to ourselves, we become ever more bound. If we're not careful, we make our lives busy, complicated, and unnecessary. We fill ourselves with a sense of vacancy and meaninglessness. Our minds become complicated by petty details and wants, and we become ever more confused. But in our quiet moments, we sense that no freedom lies in maximizing petty choices. It's the wrong game plan, and we know it. We often think that the purpose of taking up a spiritual practice is to produce good actions as opposed to bad. According to the Buddha Dharma, however, this is completely beside the point. Most of us, most of the time, tend to act with intent, trying to bring about some desired end. But nature doesn't act with intent. A Buddha doesn't either. Acting without intent means acting out of wholeness, out of seeing the whole. But why not just learn to do good as opposed to bad? Because no solid, unchanging good or bad can be established. Good and bad aren't absolutes. They are beliefs, judgments, ideas based on limited knowledge, as well as on the inclinations of our minds. The situation we always live in is like that of the wise Chinese farmer whose horse ran off. When his neighbor came to console him, the farmer said, "Who knows what's good or bad?" When his horse returned the next day with a herd of horses following her, the foolish neighbor came to congratulate him on his good fortune. "Who knows what's good or bad?" said the farmer. Then, when the farmer's son broke his leg trying to ride one of the new horses, the foolish neighbor came to console him again. "Who knows what's good or bad?" said the farmer. When the army passed through conscripting men for the war, they passed over the farmer's son because of his broken leg. When the foolish man came to congratulate the farmer that his son would be spared, again the farmer said, "Who knows what's good or bad?" When do we expect the story to end? If your idea of good opposes something else, you can be sure that what you call good is not absolute or certain. It's only in seeing that we can hope to find what lies beyond our shaky relative ideas of good and bad. If we would live in a way that is somehow beyond the uncertain dualities of the relative world, we must learn to observe our inclination of mind, our intention, our will, our thirsting desire. Don't squelch your desire or try to stop it. You'll only feed it and intensify it. The point is not to kill desire. The point is to see. The Buddha Dharma's third truth simply states that whatever is subject to arising is also subject to ceasing. And since dukkha arises, it too is subject to cessation. The cessation of dukkha, the ending of confusion, sorrow, and loss, is nirvana. The Buddha referred to nirvana as unborn, ungrown, and unconditioned. The born, grown, and conditioned refer to everything you can conceive of, including yourself. Look around you. There's nothing you can find, indeed there's nothing you can even imagine, that doesn't originate, develop, or exist in relation to other things. Being born, growing, and responding to conditions is built into the very fabric of the world we live in. But the Buddha also pointed out that there is an aspect of experience that is not born, grown, or conditioned. This unconditioned aspect is directly available to perception. We can see it, we just can't conceptualize it or pin it down. In short, our situation is anything but hopeless. There actually is something real, genuine, and true for us to see. Back when I had cancer, I would occasionally meet with others who had cancer. We always had much to share, and so it happened that I became friends with a man who was dying of the illness. I used to visit him in the hospital, but I remember one evening in particular when everything seemed different. It wasn't like the other nights I had visited him. For one thing, the hospital seemed so much quieter than usual. My friend was lying in a bed, hooked up to a machine that would sigh on occasion and break the silence every few minutes. Otherwise, it was extremely quiet, except for the radio tuned to the classical station, which was barely audible. I sat by his bed and we talked quietly for a while. Our conversation was mostly silence, just the radio and a sighing machine. He was in pain and asked me to give him a massage. I did for a few minutes, then again we talked for a while. After a silence, he suddenly put his hands over his face and gave out a forceful gasp. Reality was overtaking him at last. He had been struggling with cancer for the better part of a year, but in that moment, the reality of his death was finally hitting him. At last, he put his hands down and just stared ahead. I said to him, "Wherever we go, it's always like this." Puzzled, he looked at me and said, "What do you mean?" I gestured and said thus. The look of bewilderment remained for a moment, then his face transformed. He understood. It was the last time we spoke to each other. I sat with him a while longer in that deathly silent room with the gasping machine and the radio exceedingly soft. He died the next day. Some people think that the teaching of the awakened is nihilistic, as if it asserts a kind of nothingness, as if somehow nirvana is a lapsing into a tranquil oblivion, a floating grayness drifting in a shoreless sea. That is not nirvana. Recall that everything we see, hear, feel, and think is constant flux and change. Nothing endures. We long for permanence, and as a result we suffer, for we find none. There seems to be only this coming and going, this unending arising and ceasing. We experience everything as motion. Indeed, physicists tell us that matter is literally nothing but motion. And no matter how we look at it, at any scale, our experience is always of motion, of change. This is true of everything in the physical world, including our bodies. Every cell, indeed every atom of every cell, reveals nothing but ceaseless coming and going. Our bodies are remade moment by moment, and in no two moments are they the same. The same is true of our minds. The contents of our minds are in constant motion as well. Thoughts, feelings, judgments, and impulses arise one after another, then bloom and fade away like flowers after their season. Nirvana is seeing thoroughly and completely that this is so. We need to see our situation for what it is. We're not really crazy or stupid. We just don't see. That is, we don't pay attention to what we see. We tend to think of ourselves as persons or individuals, separate entities persisting through time, but we aren't. What we call a person, the Buddha referred to simply as stream. If you're like most people, you think of yourself as having been born. But if you look at this notion carefully, you'll see that you have no immediate experience of having come into existence at all. Trace it back. Follow your memory. Do you remember coming into existence? Of course you didn't begin at birth, but when did you begin? At conception? When exactly does conception take place? When the sperm first finds the egg? But what about that sperm and egg? When did they begin? With your parents? And when did they begin? And their parents before them? The truth is that you can't find coming into being as an event in actual experience. Everything involves what came before it in its identity. It's dependent on earlier conditions, which in turn are dependent on earlier conditions still, and so on as far back as we can trace or imagine. In other words, there's something very odd and contradictory and unsettling about this concept of coming into being. Nevertheless, here's reality, here's the world, here's thus. Let's look again at the three desires we discussed earlier, but this time from a different angle. The first, the desire for sensory pleasure, can be seen as simply the desire to please ourselves. We just want to be happy. But how can you be truly happy when you've got a death sentence on your head? This brings us to the second desire. We prefer not to die. How are you going to get around that one? If you were born, you're going to die. It's as simple as that. But what if this view of extinction, which has such a profound grip on us, turns out not to be correct? What if it is actually founded in confusion? And if it is, how can we know this and thus free ourselves from such a view? Our problem is that we don't see change as mere coming and going. Instead, we think that it somehow entails persistence, even though this is in contradiction to direct experience, which reveals only flux and change. We imagine that things come into existence, endure for a while, and then pass out of existence. Because we think this way, we have yet another desire, the desire for non-existence, the desire to control our extinction. All three of these desires arise because of our confusion about change. The Buddha talked of extinguishing these desires, but how can we do that? Isn't our very intention to do so just another desire? And doesn't one desire lead to another? It would seem that desires are inexhaustible. So what are we to do? We can stop feeding the flame of desire and let that flame diminish and go out, like a lamp that has burned all its fuel. The Buddha Dhamma offers us two ways of doing this. The first is what the Buddha called less desire. The second is often called forgetting the self. It is said that if you drop a frog in hot water, he'll jump out. If you put him in lukewarm water and very slowly raise the temperature, the frog will stay there until he dies. We're not frogs. We have the capacity to see and to know when we're sliding too far into an unhealthy situation. But we have to take note of what we see. We don't have to continue down a slippery slope. We can stop, turn around, and head in the other direction. But this can only be done when we see our situation for what it is. This backing away from the precipice is the practice of less desire. Our senses numb when we overload them. But once they're numb, it's tempting to overload them even more until we're too numb to feel much at all. This is precisely the vicious cycle of an addictive drug. The overall effect we experience is the opposite of what we desired. How can we deal with this situation? Should we attempt to snuff out our desires? Should we think of our desires as nasty or wrong or evil? Of course not. Those approaches simply add more fuel to the same fire. So what can we do? First, we see. Then we turn and gently go back. There's no pressure we need to put on ourselves. Simply by seeing how things actually are, what leads to confusion and what leads to clarity, we begin to turn around. The other way to deal with our desires is to direct the focus of our desires away from ourselves. To forget the self is to remember that we don't exist alone, but in relation to other people, to other creatures, to the planet, and to the universe. It is to focus not on ourselves as a force in charge of the manipulation of others, but on how our lives interpenetrate those of others, and indeed all the activities of a dynamic universe. Thus we have endless opportunities to forget the self, in planting a tree for future generations, in creating a poem, a meal, a vessel of clay, in playing baseball wholeheartedly, knowing that your opponents are as vital to the game as you are. Generally, our desire, our actions, our speech, and our thoughts are geared toward bringing about some particular end by exerting control. Then, when these efforts at control fail, as they inevitably must if held on to too long, we suffer. The Buddha Dhamma doesn't ask us to give up control. Instead, it acknowledges that we never had it in the first place. When we can see this, the desire to control naturally begins to wane. The point is not to try to stop exerting control or to condemn the desire to control as bad or wrong. The point is to see things as they are, to acknowledge what's really going on. Through such acknowledgement and recognition, we can cease to suffer. At the center of our desire for control is our sense of self. But with seeing, this sense loses its grip. What becomes extinguished is this false sense of self. We stop clinging to something that wasn't there to begin with. Our first reaction to this might be, but who would want that? If we look at this more carefully, we'll find profound liberation in it. For if what frightens us most is in fact illusory, then waking up to its illusory nature yields the most profound freedom. Our greatest fear is that each of us, I, will someday pass out of existence. But how can something cease to exist that had no solid existence in the first place? The Buddha said, just as a man shudders with horror as he steps upon a serpent, but laughs when he looks down and sees that it is only a rope, so I discovered one day that what I was calling I cannot be found, and all fear and anxiety vanished with my mistake. The Buddha Dharma points the way for each of us to wake up from this same basic mistake, and when we awaken, our fears and anxieties quite naturally vanish as the night fades away at the rising of the sun. The fourth truth of the Buddha Dharma, also known as the Eightfold Path, offers us a realization and a practice for bringing about the cessation of dukkha. This is not a path we can take to get from point A to point B. Its peculiar nature is that the moment we step on it, the entire path is realized at once. Still, with each step we take, we can deepen our understanding. The 8 aspects of this path are right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right meditation. We will view each of these in a moment, but first let's consider the word right. The word the Buddha actually used was samma. Samma is usually translated as right, but not right as opposed to wrong or bad or evil. Normally, the moment we say right, we've already implied wrong. We've implied dualism. For those unfamiliar with the term as it's being used here, dualism simply refers to the world of left and right, dark and light, good and bad, pure and impure. It's the psychological backdrop for our everyday world of chasing after some things and running away from others. The world in which if you differ from me, then there's something wrong with you. Obviously, this isn't what the Buddha meant by samma. The term suggests something far more subtle. It's better that we understand right as this is appropriate, this works, this is in sync with reality. Right on the Eightfold Path doesn't mean right versus wrong so much as it means seeing versus not seeing. It refers to being in touch with reality as opposed to being deluded by our own prejudices, thoughts, and beliefs. Samma refers to wholeness rather than fragmentation. Thus, when I use the word right, I intended to refer to what is conducive to awakening, rather than something that can be compared against something wrong. The first aspect of the Eightfold Path is right view. There are those who argue that the Buddha didn't have any view whatsoever, but this is not correct. What the Buddha meant by right view is not being caught by a particular view. It's not being caught by ideas, concepts, beliefs, or opinions. The view of a Buddha is of how things actually are, which in light of the constant flux and flow of the world is no one way in particular. After all, how can things be a particular way if they are in constant motion? How can a hard and fast view of a world that is never hard or fast possibly be accurate? It's not the particulars of the world that provide us with right view, but the world itself, as an ever-dynamic whole. Right view is wholesome. That is, it's of the whole. It's all-inclusive. It leaves nothing out. Such a view, by definition, does not go to war with any other view. In fact, it cannot. Since it's already of the dynamic world as a whole, we can't conceive of anything that opposes it. The second aspect of the path is right intention. It's also sometimes called right resolve, right motive, or right thought. You cannot actually learn truth from anyone. It's seen only through your own resolve. If you do not resolve to awaken, there's nothing a teacher can do for you. Right resolve or right intention is likened to a person whose hair is on fire. When your hair is on fire, you're not going to weigh the pros and cons of putting it out. If your hair is on fire, there's no waffling. You see no choice. You act. Right speech is next on the Eightfold Path. The most obvious form of right speech is avoiding lying. Whatever moral justification you may have for not lying, there are some very practical reasons for being truthful. The Eightfold Path is to keep your mind from becoming too disturbed, so that you can remain present here and now. If you were to lie, your mind would be immediately distracted. Now you have to keep track of what you said, and to whom, and to how the story should progress, and so on. There's no end. Waking up suddenly becomes more difficult. A second factor of right speech is not speaking crudely or rudely. Such speech is unnecessary, undignified, and disturbing. Other aspects of right speech include not speaking ill of others and refraining from gossip and idle talk. Obviously, wallowing in triviality, slander, or fantasy is not conducive to waking up. The fourth aspect of the Eightfold Path is right action. This is action that proceeds from an unfettered mind, a mind not embalmed in rigid thought constructs. Aspect 5 of the Eightfold Path is right livelihood. How are we to earn our keep on this planet without doing violence to others, to the environment, or to ourselves? The Buddha Dharma does not provide lists of approved professions, of course. Rather, it offers guidance to help each of us wake up to how we may earn a living that encourages openness, insight, honesty, and harmony. Right effort is closely associated with the seventh aspect of the Eightfold Path, right mindfulness. This simply means not forgetting what our real problem is, which is dukkha. Through right mindfulness, we acquaint and regularly reacquaint ourselves with the states and functions of our own minds, with how we are actually engaged in the world from moment to moment. Through this observation and awareness, we can become intimate with how we operate out of each of these mental states. The final aspect of the Eightfold Path is right meditation or right concentration. Right meditation is collecting the mind so that it becomes focused, centered, and aware. Please do not take any of these aspects of the Eightfold Path on faith. Test them out. Engage them in your own life and see for yourself whether or not they are conducive to awakening. Remember, the Buddha Dharma is about seeing, not about believing. Our prison, our dungeon, is in us. It's in our own mind, our own thinking. We strap ourselves in chains of our own making, and we do the same to each other. We train our children in the ways of bondage. All this is based on ignorance. We don't see what we are. We don't see our situation for what it is, nor do we see how to deal with it. Ordinarily, when you step on a path, you're going somewhere. You start on it, traverse it, and if all goes as planned, you arrive at your goal or destination. The path to freeing the mind is not like this. This path neither begins nor ends. Thus it's not really a path to somewhere. Furthermore, the moment you set your foot on it, you've already traversed it in its entirety. Just to be on this path is to complete it. I mean this literally, not symbolically or metaphorically. But first you have to step on the path. This is right view. You must have at least a glimmer that there's something difficult, askew, painful, or troubling about human existence. If it's true that there's something about human life that's off, what would it take to make it on, so to speak? What would make human existence meaningful or correct? In other words, what do we as intelligent beings in a vast and apparently meaningless universe really want? What would answer the hollow ache of the heart? Money? Fame? Sex? Learning? Power? Life in the fast lane? Life in the slow lane? Luxury apartments in Paris and Manhattan? A quiet cottage by a running brook? Perhaps you can sense already that none of these specifics will do the trick. Indeed, whatever object we pick can at best only temporarily still some particular yearning. The underlying ache of the heart remains omnipresent and unquenchable. What do you suppose could possibly quench an unquenchable thirst? If it's not an ordinary thirst, then why seek an ordinary cure? It's no use looking for something to take in to fulfill ourselves. We know that won't work. If we satisfy one craving, another arises to take its place. What we're dealing with here is a qualitatively different type of problem, so let's take a different approach. For once, let's not attempt to first identify whatever it is we need and want. In algebra, we typically label an unknown quantity with a letter such as A, B, or Y. We can use the same approach to label what we truly need and want. We'll call it X. X is the answer. It's what we all really want and need, even though we don't know what it is. What we do know is that everything we can think of never satisfies us. Thus we know we're looking for something that's not like anything we can think of or hold as a possession, even as a possession of our minds. Maybe, for a moment, now and then, we think or believe that there's something that will truly satisfy us. But in the next moment, we discover that we're wanting again. Sooner or later, doubts settle back in. By definition, X cannot be like this. If you realized X, whatever it might turn out to be, you'd never want again. But unlike the bright objects we commonly pursue in an effort to satisfy ourselves, we cannot seek what we truly need and want because we have no idea what we're searching for. Rather, X is like a fish that swims into the net of its own accord. What we can do, all we can do, is lower the net. What you really need and want will never appear as an object to your mind. Nevertheless, you already know truth and reality now. If only you would stop telling yourself what it is, or asking yourself what it might be, or speculating on what it might look like, it would become readily apparent. Our problem is that we don't pay attention to what we actually know. We give our attention to what we think, to what we have ideas or beliefs about, and we discard what we actually see. Starting in ignorance as we must, we haven't a clue as to what it is that we're going after. Thus we embark on a long search. We may look for truth in a book, or a creed, or a ritual, or some sacred object or place, but such things never satisfy. We've got to see this and take it to heart. The only thing that truly satisfies is seeing reality, seeing what's really going on in ourselves, in others, and in the world. Right view, the first step on the Buddha-Dharma path, begins not so much in seeing as in realizing the nature of what we're looking for. We stop looking for something that forms as an object in our mind, something we can visualize out there and then go after, as if truth were an image, an idea, or a belief. Truth is not like this. It's not something to believe or disbelieve. The things that we can believe in are always less than truth, and thus cannot satisfy. Normally, a view of the world is nothing more than a set of beliefs, a way to freeze the world in our minds. But this can never match reality, simply because the world isn't frozen. Nevertheless, we carry on as though the way we've frozen it in our minds is the way it actually is. When the Buddha spoke of right view, he was referring to a view that isn't frozen. Right view is fluid and flexible, constantly in motion. It's an awareness of how this moment has come to be. Usually we hold a frozen view of ourselves as well as of the world out there. We think we actually are something. We label ourselves. I'm a nervous type. I'm shy and withdrawn. I always talk with my hands. It's just the way I am. In short, we identify with groups, behaviors, habits, and beliefs. Because of a strong family identity, I grew up thinking of myself as Norwegian. I was probably in high school before I realized, wait a minute, I'm not Norwegian. I was born and raised in Minnesota. I can't speak Norwegian. I've never set foot in Norway. How can I be Norwegian? Nowadays, when people learn that I'm an ordained Buddhist priest, they often have some idea about who I must be, even when they have scant knowledge of Buddhism. For example, people often assume I'm a strict vegetarian, and while I never cook and eat meat at home, I have no problem if I'm served meat as a guest. Sometimes people tell me I'm a Buddhist too, and wait for me to rejoice in that. But actually, after 30 years of studying the Buddhist teaching, after priest ordination, after monastic and other kinds of training, I don't think of myself as a Buddhist. Though I am a student and teacher of the Buddha Dharma, I don't identify myself with it. Once in a while, some event occurs where I'm compelled to step forward as a priest, or as a man, or as a Buddhist, or a son, or a friend, but most of the time it's not necessary to wear any hat at all. When we latch on to an identity, it's easy to take offense, but we offend ourselves. We lock ourselves into very rigid ways of seeing and thinking and feeling and reacting. It doesn't have to be this way. The fact is, I'm not anything in particular, nor are you, nor is anyone. Another kind of bondage we place ourselves in is the concept A means B. It's a concise way of packaging the world, but is it ever possible for this to truly mean that? This freezing and framing of the world in conceptual packages provides us with innumerable explanations, none of which can adequately substitute for reality itself, and none of which can quiet the ache of the heart. The fact is, reality doesn't need to be explained. Indeed, it's the one thing that doesn't need explaining. Truth and reality are self-evident. What's to explain regarding thus, regarding the world as it actually is? What can we say about thus that doesn't remove us from it? The moment we try to capture and encapsulate truth, we have paradox, confusion, contention, doubt, and strife. We make this mistake repeatedly, and we only rarely notice we're making it. Instead, we search for an ever more detailed, complex, and accurate form of encapsulation. But what purpose does it serve to deny actual experience in order to run with an idea instead? We can't comprehend reality with our intellects. We can't pull it into a static view of something. All our explanations are necessarily provisional. They're just rigid frames of what is actually motion and fluidity. In other words, if you can think of how reality is, you can be sure that's how it isn't. Reality simply cannot be put into a conceptual form, not even through analogy, for there's nothing like it. Reality simply doesn't fit into concepts at all. Nevertheless, reality is something you can see. You can't conceive of it, but you can perceive it. For example, if I pointed to a picture of you at the age of 2 and asked, "Is that you?" what would you say? If you look carefully, you'll see that you can't get a conceptual handle on what I'm asking without getting thoroughly entangled in contradictions. I've put this question to hundreds of students in my classes over the years, and I found the response to be almost predictable. Most people will say without hesitation, "Yes, that's me." When I point out that they are not babies, the class usually falls silent. After a pause, a lone voice will invariably call out, "That was me." But how can you change, become other than what you are, and still be you? What do we suppose the word I refers to? Try as we will, we'll not find any workable, definable thing in actual experience for this I to refer to. The simple fact is, the moment we put anything into a conceptual package, we get a contradiction. Nevertheless, we can always see what's going on. As long as we don't ask the question, it's all perfectly clear. What exists in this moment is the picture of a baby and a grown person pondering how that could be this. We habitually fail to notice that by clinging to a concept, in this case I, immediate reality escapes our grasp. Whenever we conceptualize, we create contradictions that we can't escape. But it's not that reality is contradictory, it's just that it won't fit into a conceptual frame. In a famous Zen story, Emperor Wu of China asked the Buddhist teacher Bodhidharma, "Who are you?" Bodhidharma replied, "Not knowing." There's no identity there. Bodhidharma sees reality, not a thing with a name. In other words, right view isn't in the eyes of the beholder. There is no beholder of right view. Right intention, the second aspect of the Eightfold Path, is what most distinguishes a Buddha from those of us who are not awake. Why? Because in the moment we are awake, for all practical purposes, we're without intention. We could say that the intention of an awakened person is just simply to be awake. If we want to break the chain of suffering and confusion, our intention should only be to awaken. If our intention is partly to get something from being awake, however, this is already delusion. We don't get anything from being awake. If you're awake, you're just awake. And if you're awake, you will act and speak in a way that doesn't do injury to yourself or to others. Of course, in the very next moment, we must awaken again. We have to keep coming back to this moment. Thus, right intention is simply the intention to come back to this moment, to just be present with no ideas of gaining whatsoever. You cannot be here and hold a gaining idea at the same time. Just becoming here and now is enough. There's a Zen story of a fellow who sat in meditation in order to become a Buddha, not an unfamiliar intention among Zen students. His teacher came by and asked, "What are you doing?" The student replied, "I'm meditating to become a Buddha." The teacher picked up a towel and started to polish it. "What are you doing?" asked the student. "I intend to polish this tile into a mirror." "No amount of polishing will make that tile into a mirror. No amount of meditating will make you into a Buddha." We can't approach meditation as if it's a means to something. In fact, we can say that meditation is nothing other than the intention to wake up. It's important that we have a scheduled time for meditation, but we shouldn't think that we're in meditation merely because we've come to a particular place where meditation is practiced and waited for the starting bell to ring. It's not as if now we're meditating and when the bell rings again we're done. Meditation isn't like that. It neither begins nor ends, at least not with a bell. Meditation begins and ends with your intention. If you lose track of your intention to be awake, you're no longer in meditation. If you intend to meditate, then you must do your meditation now. Meditation is simply to be here, now. If you want to meditate, meditate now, even as you listen to this recording. If your intention is only to be awake, but you don't know what being awake is, what are you going to do? You can't create some idea about enlightenment and then set out to get it. Awakening isn't like that. If you want to be awake, you must awaken now. Come to this moment. Be aware of what is going on. Be aware of your intention right now. If you would be in this moment, then be awake in this moment. That's all. It's very simple. If you have ideas about this, what it is, what you're going to get from it, it's already delusion, conception. Ordinary everyday stuff. Business as usual. Right intention is almost like no intention at all. You don't intend to use right intention for something else. In fact, it's impossible to do so. The only reason to be awake is to be awake. If we're not expecting to get anything from being awake, what reason do we have to awaken? There isn't any reason. You already know what not being awake is. It's confusion, it's pain, it's suffering, it's dukkha. If you're getting tired of that, why don't you stop? But isn't that wanting to get something, we ask? Well, if we approach it in that way, then we haven't stopped it, have we? We're like the fellow in the old joke who goes to the doctor. He reaches behind his back with his right hand to touch his left elbow and says, "Doc, it hurts when I do this." The doctor looks at him and replies, "Then don't do that." We're never called on to do what hurts. We just do what hurts out of ignorance and habit. Once we see what we're doing, we can stop. Right intention simply means that your mind isn't leaning. Your ordinary mind assumes there's something out there. Either you want it and you try to get it, or you dislike it and try to keep it away. To the extent your mind leans either toward or away from certain things, longing and loathing are present. This leaning reveals your state of mind. The mind doesn't only lean toward the obvious, fame, money, sex, and such. It can lean toward anything. It can even lean toward putting an end to leaning. Oh yeah, I want enlightenment. But of course this is to lean once again. The thing you really want is for your mind not to lean. So what are you going to do about it? You may say, "Okay, I'm going to straighten up my mind." And then you struggle to straighten up your mind. But that's leaning. The mind will not be ruled. If you try to get it to lean less, it just leans all the more. So how are we ever going to get our minds to stop leaning? Just attend to what you're doing. Because in attending to this moment, you're attending to your own mind. You're watching your own mind lean. See how this leaning comes about. When you acquaint yourself with what leaning really is, you realize that in trying to stop it from leaning, you're making it lean all the more. Nevertheless, as you watch what actually takes place in each moment, already your mind has begun to lean less. You cannot make your mind not lean, at least not directly. But when you observe what actually takes place from moment to moment, the mind, of its own accord, straightens up. Samuel Johnson said we more often need to be reminded than instructed. The Buddha's words on the practice of right speech, the third aspect of the Eightfold Path, serve as a reminder of what we already know. They speak the truth, are devoted to the truth, reliable, worthy of confidence. They never knowingly deceive others for the sake of their own advantage. What they have heard here, they do not repeat there, so as to cause dissension there. Thus they unite those that are divided, and those that are united they encourage. Concord gladdens them. They delight and rejoice in concord, and it is concord that they spread by their words. They avoid harsh language and speak such words as are gentle, soothing to the ear, loving, going to the heart, courteous and dear, and agreeable to many. They avoid vain talk and speak at the right time, in accordance with facts. Speak what is useful. Speak about right wisdom and right practice. Their speech is like a treasure, at the right moment, accompanied by arguments moderate and full of sense. Actually, much of the Buddha Dharma is like this. It strikes with strong familiarity. Nevertheless, most of us need to be reminded of what we already know. What's the point of right speech? It's to remind ourselves, to constantly bring ourselves back to this moment. Not only for ourselves, but for others as well. It's to do whatever leads us out of confusion and bondage. It's to see what's really going on. The Buddha did not lay down any commandments. If we say, "Thou shalt not lie," applying it as a rule, what are we to do when the Gestapo pounds at our door and we're harboring a family of innocent fugitives in the attic? If not lying were an absolute rule to live by, we'd be in deep moral trouble. Nevertheless, it's not the case that Buddhists simply live out of their own individual truths. The Buddha Dharma is not about the Buddha's truth, or your truth, or my truth, or another person's truth. The Buddha Dharma, what the awakened teach, is about directly seeing truth itself, prior to forming any ideas about it. It is about responding to each particular situation as it comes to be, not according to some lockstep program of do's and don'ts. We can't use a hard and fast rule to deal with the dilemmas and uncertainties and ambiguities of life. A rule, any rule, would only open the door for relativism and contradiction. Picture a maple tree in late fall. Most of the leaves have fallen. Only a few leaves remain attached to the tree. You're sitting in a park. It's a beautiful day, warm for this time of year. The sky is a brilliant deep blue. Against the sky, near the top of the tree, you see a single leaf. It's a very bright reddish orange. As you're looking at it, the leaf quivers and begins to fall. It tumbles down, drifting across the sky. You turn your head slightly to follow it. It drifts down, slowly, then lands on the ground in a place where many other leaves have fallen before. You look at the pattern of leaves on the ground. You notice how near the tree there are more leaves, and how further from the tree there are fewer. As your eyes pass over the grass toward the next tree, you find more leaves on the ground once again. You raise your gaze a bit and look out across the lawn. You see places where there are more leaves and places where there are fewer leaves. Wherever you look, however, there are always beautiful patterns of varying color. Who or what can make such patterns? Ryokan, a Japanese Zen poet of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, wrote this simple poem. Maple leaf, falling down, showing front, showing back. The action of a maple leaf falling down, showing front, showing back, the way it falls from the tree, when it falls from the tree, how it falls from the tree, where it lands, all of this exemplifies right action. How different this kind of action is from the kinds of willed, goal-oriented action we're so familiar with. Imagine a maple leaf that says in midsummer, "I'm checking out. I'm getting off this tree." And there it goes, tumbling down while still green. Or imagine the leaf that won't let go. It hangs on all winter, not willing to move or change until next year's bud gives it the boot. Then there's a leaf that doesn't want to be just a leaf in the wind. When it falls from the branch, it curls up and does a cannonball to the ground. What kind of pattern would these leaves make on the ground? It would be quite different from the one described by Ryokan. Leaves, of course, have no motives. We human beings, however, operate in all three of these ways on quite a regular basis. In attempting to exert control over people, things, and events, we run away, hang on tightly, or thumb our noses and do what we please. The action of Ryokan's slowly drifting maple leaf, natural, unwilled, demonstrates right action. The actions of the other leaves, which I've illustrated in a silly way, are willed. These two types of actions lead to quite different results. Usually, discussions of morality never stray too far from rules and regulations, from thou shalts and thou shalt nots. Rules and regulations are only handy when we don't see. The point of precepts is to see, to live in accordance with reality, not to follow rules blindly. If you see, you don't need rules. In fact, rules become a hindrance. They bind our natural freedom of mind. In seeing, your actions become like leaves that land in the natural spot on the lawn. Seeing alone carries us to greater levels of moral development. Through seeing, by and by, we need not live merely by rules. Indeed, to completely mature morally as human beings, we must learn to operate in a place where rules will often be insufficient. The saint simply lives by seeing. Some Buddhists call such a person a bodhisattva. When we meet such a person, we're sometimes awestruck. We see what they do, and then we start to write down rules that seem to describe it. It looks like we ought to not lie, not steal, not kill, and so forth. Yes, the saintly person doesn't lie, we've noticed. But why don't they? Is it because they think it's against the rules? Because they think it's evil? Because they fear punishment? Because they don't want to look bad in the eyes of others? Not really. Rather, they avoid lying, stealing, and killing because they see the natural repercussions of such behavior. They see that it leads to confusion, to suffering, to dukkha. They don't do it because they see the whole scene. We generally come to the question of right action as we come to almost everything. We want to have the right answer, something we can encapsulate in a handy slogan. But try as we might, though it can be seen, morality defies any attempt we make to harness it. For example, let's consider what is widely thought of as the finest of all moral laws, the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This rule appears in virtually all societies. If there were a universal rule to live by, surely this one is it. In fact, however, it is deeply flawed. We can see this without much difficulty. Indeed, you may have seen it for yourself already. Suppose I'm a rough, cantankerous fellow who enjoys nothing better than getting into fistfights. I always obey the Golden Rule because I only do to others what I would have done to me. So wherever I go, I always get into fights. Clearly there's a problem here. It's because of this flaw that moral philosophers have tried to rephrase the Golden Rule to make it work in all cases. One popular reformulation has been what is called the inversion of the Golden Rule. This says, do unto others as they would have you do unto them. But this is still problematic. If the person you're dealing with is a child who sits at the dinner table screaming, I don't want to eat my peas. I want to eat candy. You'd be obliged to feed the child candy instead of a nourishing meal. Obviously, your moral obligation to the child can't be dictated merely by what the child demands or wants. There needs to be something more basic than this. But what? It seems we cannot live satisfactorily without morality, yet it seems equally true that we have no clear basis whatsoever for morality. As W. McNeill Dixon put it, probably upon no subject ever discussed through the length and breadth of the globe has there been expended a fiercer hubbub of words than upon this, the foundations of morality. Why should I ask God to make me good when I want to be naughty? Asked a little girl. All the wise men of the world are put to silence by this childish query. A parliament of philosophers will not resolve it. When we set out in search of an answer, we are lost. It's not a rule that's required, but seeing. The Bodhisattva lives by seeing, not by rule. What's required is to see the whole. Through seeing, it's possible to reformulate the Golden Rule without creating problems like those described above. Of course, course, in this reformulation, it's no longer a rule, a frozen directive at all. It so happens, however, that the way the awakened would put it is one of the formulations Western philosophy has rejected. Do not do unto others what you would not have done unto you. The reason this formulation has been generally overlooked in Western philosophy is because the positive formulation is thought to be more, positive. While the positive formulation would have us get out there and do something, the negative formulation seems passive. Yet this habitual response overlooks the fact that the positive formulation always presents us with intractable problems. Problems that simply don't occur with the negative formulation at all. Why? What's the difference? It has to do with will, motive, and intention. These are all deeply entangled in the positive formulation. The positive formulation tells you what you should do. The negative formulation is not prescriptive. This is the crux of the problem. There can be no final moral authority to tell you what to do, for no such authority can lie outside your own will. In other words, in order for you to be a moral agent, you must have the final authority, and indeed you do. It is precisely because we have such authority that we must take our willed actions into account. It's willed action that binds us to dukkha, to pain and confusion. The negative formulation of the Golden Rule is not a rule exactly, but more a precept. It doesn't entangle us in unresolvable quandaries because it doesn't draw upon volition. With the negative formulation, only our one-pointed intention to be awake is called upon. Actions are initiated by seeing, not by formula. The simple fact is that we cannot have a rule stating what we should do or how we should do it. The moment we positively assert such a thing, we have precisely what we would not have, a narrow, brittle, prepackaged, inflexible morality. And once again we've opened a door that lets us abandon immediate reality in favor of our beliefs and ideas about reality. Without reference to any rule, like the Bodhisattva, we already see the cause of sorrow. As for what we should do, this only becomes apparent by seeing. It's always case by case. There isn't any rule for it. Here's the basis for right action: to refrain from all that is divisive and contentious, to do what promotes harmony and unity. In short, it's to act out of seeing the whole. It's to live as a falling leaf, as the streaming wind itself. Another way to understand right action is to think of it as selfless action, action done well, free of a sense of self, action in which you don't see yourself as separate from other things. This is not to say that consciousness itself is winked out and nothing is happening. Perception is still there, of course. There's still physical sensation, including pain and pleasure. It's just that you are not there. And with the sense of self gone, your actions naturally become uncalculated and free. This occurs when your will has been filed down to a single point. Your only intention is to be awake, be present. Your actions are appropriate and free, like a leaf falling naturally from the tree. This is total freedom of mind. When we insist on hanging on to our branch, in our ignorance, we think this is freedom. I can do what I want, and if I feel like falling in midsummer, I will. And if I want to cannonball, it's my business. We don't see that what we are calling freedom is actually bondage. When we act in this way, we become prisoners of our own whims and desires. As a result, we're unable to act out of seeing our situation for what it is, moment after moment. We're only able to act according to our cravings. We think that freedom lies in making choices based on our desires. But when we see our circumstances, we see much more than just our desires. We see how the current situation has come to be. True freedom doesn't lie in having choices. We always have no choice but to act. Even if we choose not to act, we're still acting, and still making a choice. Our only choice of consequence lies in whether or not we're awake. Right livelihood, the fifth aspect of the Eightfold Path, involves earning your living in a manner that doesn't bring harm to yourself or others. There are a few ways to earn a living that can be clearly identified as not conducive to awakening. trafficking in drugs or weapons or slavery, writing propaganda for repressive governments, and so forth. And there are many ways of earning a living that don't seem clearly moral or clearly immoral at all. Just what is right livelihood when we live in such a tangled social and economic web? It's difficult to find any means of livelihood that does absolutely no harm to anyone, since everything we might do is so deeply enmeshed with everything else. In walking the path of the awakened, we're invited to look at this matter of livelihood very carefully. Indeed, we can't ignore it, because the issue will remain a serious one for most of our lives. There are no clear-cut rules to follow here. You must simply see the situation you're in. If you're in a profession that's clearly caught up in something pernicious and hurtful to people, maybe you should get out, or maybe you should stay in the field and do what you can to make it more humane. Or perhaps the best course is to look for a similar job in a more compassionate industry, even if that means taking a cut in pay. You must observe your own particular circumstances very carefully, then act. Observe your attitude as you engage in your work. See what produces entanglements, desire, and suffering. See what produces harmony, joy, goodwill, cooperation, and peace of mind. If you have trouble sleeping at night, look at how you earn your living. This is often where the problem resides. You must learn to see clearly, and thus do what is most conducive to awakening. We cannot judge others, but must each examine our own life. The Buddha Dharma is about examining our lives, our behavior, our speech, and the means by which we earn our keep on this planet, and how all these activities connect with everything else. We have only one choice. Either we awaken, or we do not. Just sit for a moment and relax. Take a couple of deep breaths. Now, try not to think of an elephant. Here's something else to contemplate. Picture a square circle. Try harder. Make an effort. As you've probably realized already, both of these exercises are by nature impossible. Often, though, we put our efforts into tasks very much like these. We focus our energies on goals that are impossible, or where the means to bring about our goals are entirely out of our hands. Thus, we often think of effort as a kind of straining, or forcing, or pushing. But with what the Buddha called right effort, the sixth aspect of the Eightfold Path, there's no straining, no forcing, no pushing, partly because right effort is conjoined with right view. When you actually see that putting your hand in a flame is painful, you don't need to strain to keep yourself from doing it. Right effort means simply being present. It means being here, staying here, and to see what's happening in this moment. It's not about trying to control, trying to bring something about, like straining to achieve enlightenment. This is much like trying not to think of an elephant. Right effort is naturalness. Naturalness of movement, naturalness of thought. It's the naturalness of becoming this moment. This is not how we usually understand effort. Usually we make an effort to control, or be different, or try something new, or improve the situation, or improve ourselves. Human history is filled with this kind of effort. And here we are with our improved human world that we've spent a great deal of time and energy working on. We've improved the rivers and the lakes and the land and our society and our ways of living to the point where we now wonder if the human race will survive. Right effort is, first of all, cutting off the fragmented and fractured states of mind that have already arisen in us. In these common states of mind, the world appears out there, divided in various ways, with one thing set against another. When we're in such a state of mind, we see things as needing to be manipulated and controlled. The Buddha called such a state of mind unwholesome, because it doesn't take in the whole scene that's being presented to us. We have to see where we can effectively apply our effort and where we can't. When we're not seeing, we put most, if not all, of our energy into the areas where we have no control. We try to control situations, people, and things over which, in fact, we have little or no influence. Sometimes we try to control our own inclinations and impulses. But it's all a lot like trying not to think of an elephant. We must first see what we can control and what we can't. Otherwise we'll waste our effort in trying to do the impossible, while ignoring what is easily within reach. Most of the time, our mental state is fragmented. Our mind is filled with thoughts like, I'm going to get what I can out of this, or I must do something for those people, or I wish my mental state weren't so scattered. Or it could be any one of the countless other ways we set one thing off against another. But what should our effort be? To drive off such thoughts like a herd of elephants? We already know they'll not be driven off. The more we try to push them away, the more we feed them, and the more they grow in strength and staying power. If we simply observe our fragmented mental state instead, seeing it for what it is rather than feeding it, whether by judging it, indulging in it, or trying to shoo it away, then it collects into full awareness of its own accord. The effort involved in gathering your scattered mind isn't an effort directly applied to a particular situation through your force of will. It doesn't follow from thinking, I see my unwholesome state of mind, now I have to cut it off. That isn't going to work. Simply by seeing your state of mind, by seeing your inclinations toward this and away from that, you are awake. All you have to do is to continue bringing yourself back to seeing. To see is to heal an otherwise fragmented mind and to prevent further scattering of mind from occurring. Usually, if something seems valuable to us, we feel we have to work hard to get it or move toward it. In the case of awakening, this doesn't work. In fact, it takes us further away from the realm of awakening. A fellow went to a Zen master and said, If I work very hard, how soon can I be enlightened? The Zen master looked him up and down and said, 10 years. The fellow said, No, listen, I mean, if I really work at it, how long? The Zen master cut him off. I'm sorry, I misjudged. 20 years. Wait, said the young man. You don't understand. I'm 30 years, said the Zen master. The young man eloquently expresses our usual way. But we're not dealing with usual stuff here. We can't take this approach if our goal is a non-obsessed mind. Most of the time, most of the people we meet are at best only partially engaged in the moment, and often we find people, or ourselves, lost in thought or reverie, barely here at all. It was a spring morning. I was on one of my daily walks around a nearby lake. The light was luscious, the flowers were beginning to bloom, the smells were heady. Suddenly I heard the loud squawking of geese. I looked up to see a flock of 20 or more birds flying in formation, almost at eye level, coming right at me. They came in fast, like the edge of a blanket being pulled over my head. As they passed over me, I could hear the rush of air over their wings. At the same moment, also coming toward me, was a jogger with earphones. Still squawking loudly, the geese passed right over the jogger's head, some canting a bit to avoid hitting her. What I found more astounding than the geese was the fact that she kept jogging. She didn't notice the geese at all. I wanted to share this remarkable event with her, even if only through a glance or a smile, but she wasn't present. How often we miss the moment simply because we're not here. We tune out much of the world and much of ourselves as well, just as the jogger did. And generally we don't even realize how removed we are from what is going on. The Buddha constantly pointed out the seriousness of this condition. In fact, to the awakened, its consequences are total. Those who are aware, he said, do not die. Those who are ignorant are as if dead already. Life is only lived in this moment, which is fleeting, changing constantly. We can't grasp it. If only we'd stop embalming life, freezing it into a view, we'd experience life as it is, and at its fullest. The importance of right mindfulness, the seventh aspect of the Eightfold Path, is that it weaves together all 7 other aspects of the path, and brings us back to reality, here and now. Mindfulness of the body is awareness of how it moves, the position of the hand, head, or tongue, our posture, our breathing, the touch of grass or sand or wood or stone underfoot, and the taste and smell of this moment. Thich Nhat Hanh, in one of his walking exercises, asks us to imagine we're astronauts who have crashed on the moon. We're stranded. We look up into the sky and see the beautiful blue earth, but we can't get back to it because our ship is damaged. All we can do is look at that brilliant blue orb in the cold black sky and long to be home again. But suppose we managed to fix our craft after all and landed once again on Earth. How would we feel as we first set foot upon the Earth? What would we observe and savor? How intensely would we experience the smells and flavors, the gentle rain, or the warm sand underfoot? This, says Thich Nhat Hanh, is how we should walk on the earth with each step. Just as we can attend to the body and to our physical surroundings, we can also take note of the present emotional backdrop of our mind. By simply attending to how we feel without trying to judge or change our feelings, we may notice that there's no real distinction to be made between self and other. If it's a gray day inside, then it's a gray day outside as well. Over time, we may also notice that each feeling we experience is transitory and impermanent. Eventually, through simple observation, our feelings, while no less vivid, will become less urgent, and will cease to have such a firm hold on our emotions and actions. We will be able to see each feeling as it arises without feeling compelled to act on it. If, in observing your feelings, an inner commentary begins, "This is good, this is bad, I don't like this," just be aware that such comments are being made. You don't have to make the further comment, "I should be watching rather than commenting." Simply attend to your background feeling. Don't try to alter it, just note it for what it is. There's also mindfulness of mind. Until we deliberately listen for it, we usually pay little attention to the fact that there's the constant chatter of a monologue, often idiotic, running in our minds. When we really lose ourselves, we can even work it up into a dialogue. Our minds jabber to themselves much of the time. If you don't think so, just sit quietly for a moment and try to remain aware of your breathing, noting when you breathe in and when you breathe out. If you do this even for 5 minutes, you will probably notice that throughout that time, your mind has toyed with innumerable thoughts, feelings, and fantasies. Our unobserved mind is the source of a great deal of confusion and suffering for us. We habitually act out of our thoughts and assumptions, most of which we're only vaguely aware of, rather than out of full engagement with the moment. To make matters worse, we often identify with our thoughts, as if substantiality could somehow be found in what we think or believe. When we carefully observe our minds, we cannot help but note that our thoughts and mental states are just as fleeting as the sensations of our bodies. Finally, there is mindfulness of dukkha itself, how and why it appears, and how to bring about its cessation. We need to become mindful of the out-of-kilterness in human life. We need to see that this out-of-kilterness arises within our own hearts and minds. Finally, we can come to see that dukkha can be put to an end by walking the Eightfold Path. A key point in the practice of mindfulness is never to chastise yourself. When you realize you haven't been mindful, don't scold yourself. There's no need for it. In fact, it gets in your way. It's only necessary that you notice that you were not mindful, although of course in doing so, you are being mindful. Just watch your mind. When you learn to see what is painful and not conducive to awakening, you'll stop doing it very naturally. While right mindfulness is to return to actual experience, right meditation, the eighth aspect of the Eightfold Path, is simply staying with our immediate experience, moment by moment. In sitting meditation, the focus of our activity involves the bare minimum, just body, mind, and breath. If at all possible, it's best to receive instruction in sitting meditation from an experienced teacher rather than from a book. It's also best to meditate with others. Nevertheless, for formal written instruction, I can do no better than to quote Zen Master Dogen from his universal recommendation for sitting meditation. For meditation, a quiet room is suitable. Eat and drink moderately. Cast aside all involvements and cease all affairs. Do not think good or bad. Do not administer pros and cons. Cease all the movements of the conscious mind, the gauging of all thoughts and views. Have no designs on becoming a Buddha. Meditation has nothing whatever to do with sitting or lying down. At the site of your regular sitting, spread out thick matting and place a cushion above it. Sit in a cross-legged position with your knees directly upon the mat. You should have your clothes and belt loosely bound and arranged in order. Then place your right hand on your left leg and your left palm facing upwards on your right palm, thumb tips touching. Thus sit upright in correct bodily posture, neither inclining to the left nor to the right, neither leaning forward nor backward. Be sure your ears are on a plane with your shoulders, and your nose in line with your navel. Place your tongue against the front roof of your mouth, with teeth and lips both shut. Your eyes should always remain open, and you should breathe gently through your nose. Once you have adjusted your posture, take a deep breath. Inhale and exhale, rock your body right and left, and settle into a steady, immobile sitting position. This instruction is for meditating while sitting on the floor, but you can also meditate sitting in a chair. Place your feet squarely on the floor. Adjust the height of the chair with a pad or a blanket if necessary, so that you will sit with your thighs parallel to the floor. Keep your back straight. Do not lean against the back of the chair. If you choose to sit on a cushion on the floor, adjust the height of the cushion to ensure that your knees rest on the mat. If you prefer a kneeling posture, you may wish to support your body by placing a cushion between your legs. After you have rocked your body and settled into your sitting position, bring your attention to your breath. Sitting erect, breathe fully and deeply from your diaphragm. Breathe from the center of your body. Place your focus on your breath. Breathe naturally and quietly. Don't force the breath in any way, just follow it. As you inhale, be aware of breathing in. As you exhale, be aware of breathing out. In the beginning stages, since it's difficult to stay with the breath, counting each breath may help you maintain your concentration. Count 1 as you inhale, 2 as you exhale. Continue counting to 10, then repeat. Again, just follow the breath. As you do, thoughts will arise. Don't be bothered by them. Don't think they're bad or that you shouldn't be having them. Don't try to drive them away. If you leave them alone, they'll depart of their own accord. This is how to cease all the movements of the conscious mind. You cannot do it by direct application of your will. If you find you've been distracted by thoughts and feelings and have forgotten your breath, just come back to the breathing. There's no need to scold yourself that you wandered away. To scold yourself is to wander away again. Resume counting from 1. As you meditate, all kinds of self-comments may arise. There I go again, or I can't do this, or I'm not very good at this, or even I'm not sure I'm doing this right. These comments are quite normal. Observe them and let them go. They will depart if you let them. Don't strive for some special state of mind. There is no special state of mind. If you strive for some special state of mind, you'll only disturb your mind. This sitting meditation is not trance. It is not rest. It is not relaxation. It is just awareness of breath, that's all. Gradually, as your concentration increases, you can count just the exhalations, then just the inhalations. Once you can stay with the breath fairly regularly, you can stop counting and follow the breath alone. Beyond these simple instructions, the meditation itself will teach you what it is. You will gradually learn to sit like a mountain. Though thoughts will arise, they are merely clouds passing by the mountain. The mountain need not be perturbed by clouds. The clouds pass on, and the mountain continues to sit, observing all, grasping at nothing. People often ask me how long or how often they should sit in meditation. This is up to you. The morning, before the world becomes too stirred up, is a good time. Or evening. Begin by meditating for 5 minutes. Gradually you can increase. 20 or 30 minutes is good. But what is most important here, far more important than how much you meditate, is that you do it with regularity. Your meditation should become an activity you do regularly, like eating and sleeping. When it's time to eat, just eat. When it's time to sleep, just sleep. When it's time to breathe, just breathe. And when it's time to meditate, just meditate. Meditating with others is helpful because they will reflect you. They will help you see yourself. But more than that, meditation with others offers support and encouragement for the long haul. It's not always so easy to establish a meditation practice on your own. You can't approach meditation as business as usual. In meditation, if it's truly meditation, what we're doing is not for the sake of anything. It's done wholly for its own sake. In other words, it's useless. Ordinary, useful activity is caught up in calculation and weighing and pricing and evaluating. Meditation has nothing to do with any of these. Don't expect to get anything from meditation, including enlightenment. If you really want enlightenment, just notice what thus, mind, actually is. Notice that a grasping mind is the antithesis of what you say you want. If meditation were just another activity, our usual activity of trying to get, trying to change, trying to control, trying to bring about, then what's the point of doing it? It's more of what we always do and repeatedly suffer from. The Buddha Dharma is not an armchair philosophy, but a thoroughgoing practice. There's no point in meditating just to get the idea of it. Useless though it is, right meditation is the very activity that works on the deep, aching needs of the heart. Do right meditation, even though it's useless. Do it for no purpose. Do it for its own sake. In fact, there is no other way. If you have the least gaining idea, you are not fully engaged. You are not practicing right meditation. Right meditation is where everything is alive, where we neither create nor manipulate, neither possess nor obsess, neither try nor fail. There are two kinds of knowledge and two types of views. One consists of beliefs, opinions, conjectures, having an idea of something. It's an intellectual grasping of concepts. This is how we commonly think of knowledge. But this is not true knowing. In fact, the natural results of relying on mere conceptual knowledge are fear, discomfort, and confusion. In short, dukkha. We think that our beliefs and ideas can be relied upon to give us satisfaction. But if we examine the effects they have on us, we'll discover that, at best, they only temporarily satisfy us. In fact, they're actually our primary sources of anxiety and fear, because they're always subject to contradiction and doubt. By their very nature, all our ideas and beliefs are frozen views, fragments of reality, separated from the whole. In other words, because we rely on what we think, conception, rather than on what we see, perception, there's unrest in our mind. Underneath it all, we're uneasy, and furthermore, we know it. The fact is, we are already enlightened, even now. We know truth. We just habitually overlay our direct experience of truth with thoughts, with beliefs and opinions and ideas. We pile them all into our conceptual frame, not recognizing the consequences of what we're doing. The problem is not so much that we do this. In fact, we can hardly help but conceptualize. The real problem is that we are caught by our concepts. We don't have to grant them power or accuracy or validity that they don't have. We simply need to recognize that our concepts are not reality. The mistake we make, over and over again, is to automatically posit something in our thoughts without realizing what we've done. And then we run away with our idea, thinking we've captured some aspect of reality. What we overlook is that underneath the ground of our beliefs, opinions, and concepts is a boundless sea of uncertainty. The concepts we cling to are like tiny boats tossed about in the middle of a vast ocean. We stand on our beliefs and ideas thinking they're solid, but in fact, they, and we, are on shifting seas. Any ideas or beliefs we hold in our minds are necessarily set against other ideas and beliefs. Thus we cannot help but experience doubt. This is the deep end of dukkha, existential angst. It's the realization that beneath all our ideas, there's profound, unremovable doubt. In the very moment that we overlay our actual direct experience with conceptual thought, doubt is right there, forever wedded to it. To see separate, distinct forms is to conceptualize. This doesn't refer only to ideas and thoughts. Physical objects, a cup or a book, are still conceptual. They're still things that we've framed in our minds, separated out from the whole, and contrasted against everything else. We can talk about them, we can use them, we can manipulate them. We can seek them out, long for them, or push them away. But we shouldn't take these conceptualized, frozen, separated out objects for reality. That's where we go wrong. That's where we give rise to dukkha. The biggest mistake we make in confusing a concept with reality is in making that nearest and dearest and most fundamental distinction, the separation of self and other. I am over here, and over there is a world external to me. Unquestioningly believing this to be a full and accurate description of reality, we ignore immediate experience and seek for things, comfort, happiness, meaning, out there. Go for it, we say. And our confusion remains undiminished even when we seek such things in here. We even turn enlightenment into such an object. But in doing so, we fail to see that we've made it just another concept, another idea, another item to go after, something quite ordinary and illusory. But if we look closely at our immediate experience, we simply cannot find such a division. Indeed, the harder we look, the more absurd and impossible such a distinction becomes. If we are ever to find certitude, real knowledge that is beyond all doubt and misunderstanding, it's clearly not going to come from our vying concepts and beliefs. Rather, true knowledge must appear before all our ideas and opinions. In other words, it's nothing other than immediate, direct experience of the world in and of itself. True knowledge is seeing thus. Seeing thus is the unshakable ground we long for simply because it cannot be doubted. Herein lies freedom of mind, and herein lies fearlessness as well. With the two types of views, there are two kinds of minds. As human beings, we all have what we could call ordinary minds, the mind that you've always assumed you've had. It's a calculating mind, a discriminating mind, a fragmented mind. It's the mind of ordinary consciousness, the mind of self and other. We generally think of it as my mind. But there's another mind that is unborn, ungrown, and unconditioned. Unlike your mind, it's unbound, for there's nothing beyond it. To this mind, there is no other mind. This mind is nothing other than the whole. It's simply thus, the fabric of the world itself, the ongoing arising and falling away that are matter, energy, and events. Speaking of this mind, the great Chinese Zen master Wang Po said, "All Buddhas and ordinary people are just one mind. This mind is beyond all measurements, names, oppositions. This very being is it. As soon as you stir your mind, you turn away from it." This mind is self-evident. It's always switched on, so to speak. We can, and in fact we do, see it in every moment. If we would only refrain from stirring our minds, rest our frontal lobes, as my Zen teacher used to say, and let our conceptualizing die down like ripples on a pond after the stirring wind has ceased, we would realize, we would know mind directly. At the close of the second millennium, it's becoming harder and harder for us to find meaning in our lives. We've seen through too many of our old stories. Religion doesn't grip most people today as it once did. Though a lot of people know that and still desperately cling to it, underneath it all, God doesn't seem to be the final answer for many of us. We don't really live as if we believe in God. Still, in desperation, we swing between the twin perils of cynicism and dogmatism. We continue to run to this or that to inject meaning into our lives. We don't easily understand that we create this problem of meaninglessness ourselves through our deluded thinking. If we could just see this moment for what it is, meaninglessness would never arise in the first place. It's in our very trying to define and arrange things for ourselves, trying to identify and assign meanings to things, that we end up creating a world that is ultimately meaningless. Whatever we hold up as the meaning of life will ultimately show itself to be hollow or false or contradictory. Yet we keep digging in that same bag, continuing to search fruitlessly for a conceptual explanation. Either that, or we fall into despair. We've tried this, we've tried that, we've tried the next thing, and the next. We've become sophisticated, jaded. After all our searching, all the philosophy and science that we've labored on for centuries, it's becoming very hard to find a story we can buy. Liberation of mind is realizing that we don't need to buy any story at all. It's realizing that before our confused thought, there actually is reality. We can see it. All we have to do is learn to fully engage in this moment as it has come to be. For this, the Eightfold Path points the way. The deep, hollow ache of the heart arises from a life in search of meaning. But it's by our very desire to find meaning that we create meaninglessness. The very idea of looking for purpose and meaning arises from our deluded thought. When we actually see reality for what it is, all questions of meaning are transcended, and we're free to engage the world as it actually is. Joseph Campbell said we short-circuit religious experience by putting it into a concept. It's true. Much of religious teaching is hammered onto conceptual frames. This is as true of Buddhism as it is of any other religion. If we would awaken, however, we must notice the framework upon which we've attached everything. Ultimately, if we truly seek a free mind, even this Eightfold Path, even Buddhism itself, must not be clung to. We shouldn't make the Buddha Dharma into something holy, something to put up on a gilded pedestal in a prominent place. This path simply reminds us of how we're engaged in the world. It's like the raft that carries us to the opposite shore. We use it to a point, then leave it behind. Once the stream is crossed, we leave the raft for someone else. We don't need to lug it around. It will only burden us. The time of the Buddha was one of great philosophical confusion, much like our time today. Many different religious ideas and systems were offered, discussed, and followed. One idea that had been developing for centuries was the existence of a metaphysical self called the Atman. The Atman was thought to be eternal. The people who believed this theory of an eternal self or soul were thus known as eternalists. The eternalist theory says that there's an everlasting core in each of us, temporarily housed in a body that is subject to death and decay. This eternal self survives the corruptible body beyond death. With such a soul theory in place, other attendant notions emerged as well, including the idea of a creator God. Soon, an opposite notion arose to counter the Atman theory. A group of philosophers in ancient India, known as materialists, argued that there's no such entity as the Atman, an eternal self or soul, within humankind at all. The death of the body is the death of the psychophysical being, they said. The whole person dies and decays along with the body. All that remains after death is just matter, a functionless body which soon decays. The materialist's idea was that while matter is eternal, there is no enduring self. Though such theories were debated long ago in India, we find the same ideas being tossed about today. Indeed, even after centuries of serious debate in ballyhoo, the same fight still rages, and the same essential questions continue to arise. What am I? Why am I here? What does it mean to be human? How did I come to be? What happens to me when I die? Do I go on after death? Will I ever be able to find conclusive answers to these questions? This is the human problem, the problem of being. It drives us one by one, generation after generation, to pain and sorrow. This is the real underlying problem all our suffering stems from, a problem we can't dismiss. The discomfort of confusion, the agony and horror of being intelligent enough to know that we will die, the realization that everything we believe and everyone we know will come to an end. How can we deal with these? How can we deal with this profound problem of being without resorting to speculation and belief? We are deluded about self. In one form or another, we're very confused about this perennial idea of the Atman, the eternal self or soul. Do we all have one or don't we? Whether we latch on to yes, no, or even I don't know. What we're left with is disturbing, to say the least. Try to defend any of these positions, and you'll find it impossible. Any answer we come up with fails to still the deep, persistent ache of the heart. In fact, each of these three options leads us inevitably to still more frightening and confusing prospects. If we say yes, then we put everything on the belief that the self, or Atman, is the center of reality. If we believe in such an everlasting self, it's tantamount to proclaiming that we have existed before all else came into being. We may as well fancy ourselves as being the cause of all creation. If we say no, there is no self, then our mind starts spinning in another direction. If there's no self, then who or what is it that's experiencing our lives? What is it that senses and feels and expresses itself? If all is just matter and energy, how can we account for perception and consciousness? Why isn't the whole universe lifeless and consciousless? What is it that's asking all these questions? And what is it that's feeling this deep heartache and confusion? If we say no, we're faced with the problem of being intelligent creatures in a meaningless universe. What could possibly be more unsettling than this? If we say in all honesty, I don't know, how long can we go on without a definitive answer to this all-important question? How long before our persistent heartache, our existential confusion, and our despair become unendurable? And if we simply turn away from the question, how long before our denial crumbles under the weight of dukkha? Will we be able to continue to ignore or deny the question on our deathbed? Beyond the profoundly disturbing nature of these questions, the fact is that there's no evidence in our actual experience to support any of these positions, including I don't know. If we take any of these positions, we do so as an act of faith. A faith that is itself both profoundly disturbing and highly susceptible to doubt. It was this profound problem that the Buddha set out to clarify and demolish it he did, totally and without question. The resolution lies with neither yes nor no, but nor does it lie in don't know, because the fact of the matter is, we do know. We're just not very good at recognizing what it is that we actually know. The Buddha saw through this seemingly unanswerable question. What he found was a view that has no counter, a view that appears the same to all who see. In doing so, he understood that both the eternalist view, there is a self, and the materialist view, there is no self, only matter, were extreme and unverifiable accounts of reality. The Buddha Dharma is called the middle way because it rejects any extreme view, what the Buddha called frozen views. These are views that attempt to wrap reality into nice, neat packages. All the views we hold, and hold dear, appear in sets of two or more. Most often they appear as pairs of opposites, pro and con, Western and Eastern, liberal and conservative, dualistic and non-dualistic. For example, people are basically good, posits an ultimate quality of goodness, then attributes this quality to every member of our species. As soon as it's offered, however, it immediately invites a counter-view. People are basically evil. This is essentially the same view, but leaning in the opposite direction. Can you see, based on your immediate experience alone, that neither of these views point to reality? They are both concepts, attempts to freeze reality into something hard, fast, solid, and packaged. Review your own experience. Do you find a specific thing called goodness that provides the primary motivation for everyone you've met? What about evil? Do you find that evil exists as a specific thing, and that it serves as the biggest motivation in every human being's life? Inherent goodness and inherent evil are both frozen views, notions, concepts. They don't refer to anything in actual experience. This is not to say that people don't act in ways that could be called good or evil, but only that inherent goodness and inherent evil are conceptual inventions, philosophical objects of our own creation. Both of these views fail to point to reality. Reality is far more fluid than either of these extreme views is capable of indicating. Indeed, any such frozen view is by definition extreme, and therefore incapable of reflecting reality. What we generally fail to appreciate is that it's simply by our holding onto a specific view, believing in it, relying on it, clinging to it, that it becomes frozen and extreme. The Buddha repudiated all such views. Because they are by nature conceptual, they attempt to freeze the world into solid, separate entities, whether those entities are goodness, evil, selves, non-selves, books, light, enlightenment, Buddhism, or anything or thought whatsoever. Of course, all such attempts fail. The world of experience simply isn't frozen. Reality won't be condensed into concepts. Our immediate direct experience bears this out. Many people understand that the Buddha denied the existence of an everlasting, unchanging self. And they're right. The Buddha did see through the extreme view of the eternalists. What is less understood, however, is that the Buddha also denied the opposite extreme view, that of the materialists or nihilists. What is worse, many people think the Buddha said there is no self, therefore Buddhism is a religion of nihilism. This is like thinking, since you don't believe that God is a handsome elderly gentleman with a long white beard who lives in the clouds, you must be an atheist. It's very easy to get caught up in such dualities without realizing that we're doing so. To deny a concept is not to embrace its opposite. When you say no to the question, is the boogeyman still hiding in your closet? You're not saying that the boogeyman has gone out for the day. You are denying the validity of the question itself. The Buddha denied the question, is there a self or not, in just the same way. The Buddha saw that neither option, neither extreme, reflects actual experience. In fact, the question itself pertains no more to reality than does the question, is the boogeyman still hiding in your closet? They are both based on totally unsubstantiated assumptions about reality. When we first ask what the term self actually refers to, confusion sets in immediately. If we look up the word self in a dictionary, we find that it's generally defined as not other. What is other then? Not self. This doesn't get us anywhere. We can see that the term self refers to the existence of a supposed entity that doesn't change. When you say, when I was 6 years old, I was in first grade, the I refers to something that must have been the same at the age of 6 as it is now. If it isn't the same, then what in the world does I refer to? And if the entity is the same, what's the same about it? Its memory? The cells that make up its body? All of these have changed drastically over the years and continue to change now. To assume the existence of a self, an I, is to assume the existence of something that has not changed, that has remained itself through all these intervening years. And if the thing in question, the I, has changed, in what manner can it still be itself? To change would mean it has become something else. It's impossible for anything to remain itself and yet change, but this is precisely the thing we can't find, a self that doesn't change. For that matter, as we have seen, we can't find anything that doesn't change. In fact, we can't find any solid thing at all. Whatever you can point to, a physical thing, a person, a thought, an emotion, all are without self. All of them change. Even memory shows nothing but flux and change. There's nothing, no component of mind or body that isn't in constant flux. Whether we talk about our physical body or the bodies of the natural world, animals, plants, stones, lakes, raindrops, stars, or the objects of our purposeful world, chairs, windows, milk cartons, and sewing needles, we find nothing but flux and change. Every atom, every minuscule part of the universe is nothing other than movement and change. The same is true of our mental experience, our feelings, thoughts, and images. It's an indisputable fact of experience, of our direct immediate perception, that all things are empty of self. Yet we think and believe and act and hope otherwise. It's by holding on to this notion of self, and we hold it most dear, that we live in defiance of reality. This is the means by which we suffer, and suffer greatly. It hurts to defy reality. Of course, the term I can, indeed must, be used in conventional ways in order for us to talk with one another, and write and read books and so on. But it's not a very accurate term. When the Buddha spoke of individuals, he often used a different term, stream. Imagine a stream flowing, constantly moving and changing, always different from one moment to the next. Most of us see ourselves as corks floating in a stream, persisting things moving along in the stream of time. But this is yet another frozen view. According to this view, everything in the stream changes except the cork. While we generally admit to changes in our body, our mind, our thoughts, our feelings, our understandings, and our beliefs, we still believe I myself don't change. I'm still me. I'm an unchanging cork in an ever-changing stream. This is precisely what we believe the self to be, something that doesn't change. The fact is, however, that there are no corks in the stream. There is only stream. What we conceptualize as cork is also stream. We are like music. Music, after all, is a type of stream. Music exists only in constant flow and flux and change. Once the movement stops, the music is no more. It exists not as a particular thing, but as pure coming and going, with no thing that comes or goes. Look at this carefully. If this is true, how a stream exists, how music exists, and how we exist, see how it is that when we insert the notion of I, we've posited some little solid entity that floats along, not as stream, but like a cork in a stream. We see ourselves as solid corks, not as the actual stream we are. If we are the stream, what is it that experiences the flux, the flow, the change? The Buddha saw that there is no particular thing that is having an experience. There is experience, but no experiencer. There is perception, but no perceiver. There is consciousness, but no self that can be located or identified. We experience dukkha because, not seeing the true nature of things, we long for something permanent, something that doesn't change, yet our actual experience provides nothing but change. Because of this basic confusion, we long for something we can get our hands on. We want to hold it, to cling to it. What we love, we want to last. What we hate, we want to get rid of forever. Because of change, however, what we hate can't be forever kept away, but returns. Because of change, what we love doesn't remain, but surely fades. If we'd only relaxed, we'd notice that because of change, what we love continues to appear, and what we hate never lasts forever. We'd also observe that there is no abiding self to be either pleased or damaged. This is what we have to see, that all is flux and movement and flow. It's because we believe that there's some static being in the midst of all this, an imagined permanence we call I, that we suffer dukkha. As we've seen, once we've fixed on the idea of a universe full of separate, unchanging, persisting things, we've already created the notion that each thing must have gotten started at some moment in the past. We also necessarily conceive that each thing must die, must one day come to an end. And when the thing in question is the imagined I, this prospect naturally terrifies us. But if we pay very close attention to our actual experience, we'll notice that we don't find anything like this occurring, ever. All we ever find is the arising and ceasing of the world as it has come to be now. When you snap your fingers, it's already gone. All that persists is thus. Thus is not an object of mind, but mind itself. There is only this eternal arising and ceasing, but there's no thing that comes or goes. This is our actual experience from moment to moment. If we would just see, just rely on perception alone, we'd see the ongoing arising and ceasing of the world as it has come to be now. And all our confusion about the nature of existence would vanish instantly. Our only hope of cutting off dukkha at its source is not through more exploration, theorizing, or partying, but through learning to see directly just how we're chronically confused. It seems that it has always been our lot to experience dukkha. If we're human, we habitually conceptualize our experience, thus conceiving a self. The fact that this self is unlocatable contradicts direct experience and is quite literally impossible. Doesn't do much to weaken the sense we generally have that it exists somewhere inside us, if not in our bodies, then at least in our minds. We should notice, however, that once we have a firm belief in self, we can't account for our experience at all, and consciousness must remain totally mysterious. Furthermore, we suffer deep existential angst because we misinterpret actual experience. Instead of simply attending to what we actually perceive, we conceive a self and then quiver in our boots, afraid that it might be taken away, injured, or made unhappy. Of course, we can't just drop our notion of a self as we would remove a garment. It's a rather compelling illusion. The only way we'll see what's illusory about it is to learn to take note of our actual experience and see just how it differs from our thoughts and concepts about it. Once it's seen that the I cannot be found, the mind is free and is no longer afraid. It's very much like no longer fearing the boogeyman. As children, our fear of this fellow may have been quite strong and very real. Then we matured, and the fear disappeared. Not because we found ways to keep the boogeyman out of our closets with chants and rituals, not because we found effective ways to barricade our closets at night, not because we've learned to get our minds off the boogeyman by distracting and entertaining ourselves all day, until night falls anyway. It disappeared because we awoke to reality. The boogeyman never existed in the first place. We saw that the terrifying creature that we feared for years existed only in our imaginations. So it is with our sense of self. The issues of what a self is, how long it will last, and what will happen when our bodies die and decay and our consciousness flickers off, are all based not on what we actually see, but on what we imagine. The horrendous issues we've always feared turn out to exist only in our thoughts, concepts, and imaginations, not in reality. By attending carefully to our actual direct experience, each of us can see this directly. And when we do see this, we're released from far more than irrational fears of a childhood fantasy. We're free of the deep fear and horror that have relentlessly plagued humankind. Each one of us can awaken from this pain without resorting to stories or gimmicks. We can finally see that we've been distressed and worried over an illusion. We've seen that the abiding self or soul we commonly assume we are is an illusion, a figment of the imagination. Perhaps we've also begun to understand that we conceive all the innumerable aspects of the world in the same manner. Rather than see the wind, or waves, or a stream, or a cup, or a book, as the constant flux that each is, we imagine them to be solid, persisting, separate, unchanging things. We attribute this thingness to them in the same way that we attribute selfhood to human beings. Instead of seeing the thoroughgoing motion, flux, and flow of experience, we imagine a vast proliferation of innumerable separated things. In short, we drain selfhood to whatever we find out there. Then we make another error. Just as we conceive of a self and counter this notion with a non-self, so also are we taken in by another set of opposing concepts, existence and non-existence. We get repeatedly caught in this duality, unwilling to see that, like self and not self, both are phantoms created by consciousness. These concepts simply don't capture reality. The Buddha expressed this situation eloquently. This world is generally inclined toward two views, existence and non-existence. To them who perceive with right wisdom the uprising of the world as it has come to be, the notion of non-existence in the world does not occur. To them who perceive with right wisdom the ceasing of the world as it has come to be, the notion of existence in the world does not occur. When we just see, when we rely on perception alone, before the arising of any concept of some enduring, unchanging self, separate and apart from everything else, then the concept of non-existence doesn't occur. Our belief in non-existence arises only as the result of holding the notion of existence in the first place. It's only because we so thoroughly believe in and so strongly feel the sense of I and the world apart from me that we experience confusion, fear, and trembling. Conversely, if we perceive with right wisdom the ceasing of the world as it has come to be in this moment, if we see the fleeting nature of all things without overlaying what we see with concepts, then the notion of a permanent self doesn't occur. Though there's still thought and sensation, there is no notion of a permanent self, only peace of mind and fearlessness. It's the same whether we talk about the arising or ceasing of me or of the world, since both of these illusions occur at once. With perception alone, in the absence of conception, neither the notion of self nor of a world external to self occurs. It's only when we posit the concept of existence that we're driven to either of the two wretched extremes of eternalism or nihilism, or to oscillating between them. As the Buddha pointed out, neither of these conclusions can be derived from our actual experience. When the Buddha said, "To them who perceive with right wisdom," we should understand that this perception is available to us all right now. We all perceive the same, whether we're a Buddha or not. We all perceive truth and reality right now. If this were not so, there'd be no hope of awakening. An ordinary person is simply one who is not awake in this moment. A Buddha is a person who is, that's all. The movement of the senses, our sensual experience of the world, is no different for a Buddha than it is for anyone else. What's the difference, then, between a Buddha and an ordinary human being? The difference is not in perception. It's in conception. To a Buddha, to a person with right wisdom, there's no habitual overlaying of perceptual experience with concepts, with ideas, beliefs, notions, preformed habits of thought that are used to explain experience. Thus we all have the capacity to awaken. Our usual way is to take sense experience, perception, and immediately, before we even know we're doing it, we divide our seamless direct experience into concepts. Then we label these concepts, organize them, and hang them in an elaborate and cherished framework that we have long and laboriously built upon. A Buddha, however, isn't caught by this. When Buddhas conceptualize, and they do, they realize what they're doing and aren't taken in by it. After all, it's not conceptualization itself that's the problem, but getting caught up in it, mistaking our concepts for reality. The awakened may have thoughts and concepts just like anyone else. The difference is that they're aware that what they actually see differs from what they think. The Buddha called this awareness right wisdom. In our confusion, it can be easy to think that what I've been discussing thus far is abstract, hypothetical, or distant from our practical, everyday lives. This is a great error. We have it completely backward, in fact. If we see truth and reality, the arising and ceasing of the world as it has come to be in this moment, then we immediately see that the stuff of our ordinary thought is abstract, concept-ridden, and irrelevant to truth. The stuff we commonly take for reality, such as myself, is highly conceptual, and thus divorced from reality. But what is real and true is immediately perceivable without any abstract thought, any concepts whatsoever. How do we account for actual experience without being confused by it? This isn't a mere academic question. It has immediate, practical value, because what arises out of our confusion determines how we treat each other, the planet, and ourselves. The Buddha Dharma encourages us to notice that our common sense view of things, our basic background assumptions about ourselves and about the world, is based on a grand illusion, and it can help us pinpoint exactly what the illusion is. Consciousness is nothing more than the splitting of reality into this and that. Consciousness is making distinctions and drawing lines. That is set off over there, and you're set off over here. Consciousness divides what is otherwise the direct experience of a seamless whole into the world of multiplicity, the world of space and time. Because of consciousness, the universe appears out there, loaded with stuff. And likewise, because of consciousness, here I am as well. We engage in conceptualizing to clarify, to understand, to find certitude. We vainly try somehow to express truth in language. If we can pin it down, we think, then we'll have it. Yet what we attempt to get through our grasping, peace of mind, the lack of confusion, is lost by our very attempt to grasp truth and reality. How long does it take for us to see that we go nowhere with this process? It's the perennial issue. We teach uncertainty, doubt, and meaninglessness to our children, all in the name of truth. Thus we give rise to dukkha for ourselves and each other. And it just goes on, generation after generation, the continuation of greed, anger, and ignorance. We have packaged and repackaged again our thoughts and beliefs, constantly organizing and reorganizing them. But by now, we know that we will never touch reality that way. Reality is seeing, direct perception alone. No means are necessary. Truth and reality are simply not to be found in any way we frame our thoughts. Indeed, the more we search for truth among our thoughts and beliefs, the more subject to doubt we become. When we cease to be bound by our concepts, our paradigms, our grasping, or our inclinations of mind, our doubt ceases as well, because our knowledge is no longer dependent on anything beyond immediate, direct experience. Seeing doesn't require conception, language, or memory. Herein, said the Buddha, knowledge is not other-dependent. Herein lies freedom. There can be no secret teachings regarding truth and reality. Truth is here for all to see. We're fully equipped to just see right now. Nagarjuna, the brilliant Buddhist philosopher of 2nd century India, wrote, "Those who do not understand the distinction between the two truths do not understand the profound truth embodied in the Buddha's message. These two truths are relative truth and absolute truth. Relative truths are the day-to-day things and thoughts we can easily discuss, teach, sell, and conceptualize. These include simple facts. A foot is 12 inches, oranges contain vitamin C, Mount McKinley is in North America. But feet, inches, oranges, rocks, birds, feelings, and thoughts are themselves also relative truths. Each one depends on a vast multiplicity of other things, other concepts, other relative truths for its existence. An existence which is, of course, 100% conceptual. Relative truths are the concepts we use to get an easy handle on the world. They help us in our everyday lives with a huge variety of practical matters. But the more closely we look at them, the less real they show themselves to be. Nevertheless, relative truths aren't to be avoided. They're not necessarily evil or harmful or wrong. Indeed, they're essential. In order to get through the day, we need to know things: telephone numbers, store hours, potatoes, growing seasons, fractions, love, speed limits, how to fasten shoes. We run into trouble when we forget that all these things, thoughts and feelings, are relative, that they're not real, independent entities at all. They exist only in relation to other things, thoughts and feelings. Ultimate truth, on the other hand, is direct perception, and what is directly perceived, as opposed to conceived, is that no separate individualized things exist as such. There's nothing to be experienced but this seamless, thoroughgoing relativity and flux. In other words, there are no particulars, but only thus. Ultimate truth can't be conceptualized or imagined. You cannot hold ultimate truth in your mind at all. You can see it, you just can't hold it as an idea. Ultimate truth appears the same to all who see. It can't be countered or doubted or discounted because it is immediate, direct experience itself. It's not other-dependent. It has no other. What's ultimately true can't be held in opposition to something else. We can actually see this. We can, in fact we do, see for ourselves right now ultimate truth and reality. Our only problem is that we ignore what we see. When Buddhas look at the world, they don't see solidity. They don't see selves. They see only flux. This is not to say that the awakened no longer see forms like the rest of us. They do. But they see forms, or rather, formness, as illusory. They see that all things arise together. They see that the apparent existence of anything is dependent on all that it is not. And they see this dependence as nothing other than change and motion themselves. The Buddha called this phenomena dependent arising. Dependent arising is the formula. When this arises, that becomes. When When the days lengthen, spring flowers bloom. When days shorten, autumn colors appear and leaves fall from the trees. Spring flowers are inseparable from lengthening days. Autumn colors are inseparable from days of less and less light. Indeed, spring flowers are the longer days. Fall colors are the shorter days. In reality, all phenomena work together as a seamless whole. Dependent arising is not vague, mystical, remote, intellectual stuff. The Buddha Dharma is very practical and down to earth. Just pay very close attention to your actual experience, and you'll see it for yourself. Though it's seemingly filled with a multitude of forms, the world as a whole has no intention, no inclination, no leaning of mind as we do. The whole generates these apparent forms and patterns in a way our willed action cannot. The falling of a leaf from a tree, the flow of a stream, the sound and movement of wind, all these are natural, effortless, wondrous, deeply alive. And all are activities that are unwilled. Unwilled action, over time, will produce a natural pattern of leaves on the grass. Willed action will not. Willed actions, actions undertaken by our ordinary minds of longing and loathing, are based on illusions, on concepts. They're born of thinking that this and that are real, solid, and intrinsically separate. An assumption which sets the stage for the working of will. But the whole has no will. It leans neither toward nor away. This doesn't mean that we're incapable of acting in a natural way. We are. In fact, this is precisely how a Buddha acts, out of the whole. Our chronic problem has to do with intention. Because we ignore the whole, we're taken in by the parts. We're seduced by the objects of our consciousness, our concepts. And, with longing and loathing, greed and anger, our minds start to lean toward and away. This is dukkha. There's a way out of this dilemma. It's simply to watch your own mind and to know when it's leaning. Earlier we visualized a leaf falling from a tree. We saw it land within a pattern of leaves upon the ground. While it's a pattern we cannot replicate by a simple act of will, nature has no trouble producing random patterns at all. What controls the placement of leaves in an utterly random way, yielding a pattern that is so strikingly beautiful? The whole, of course. We can't know all the details of the whole. For example, if we knew everything about the weather system on this planet, we would be able to accurately predict the weather over an extended period. But to do this, we would have to know every little detail, right down to the positions and movements of each atom. And of course we can't do that. Natural systems, like our planet's weather, are and always will be under the control of the intentionless whole. But while we can't know the details of the whole, the fact is that we, each one of us, already know the whole itself. There's nothing mysterious about reality, thus, at all. It is ever present, clear, and obvious. Rather than trying to figure something out, trying to see, or trying to reunite with the whole, all we have to do is to notice whether our mind is leaning or not. When you notice that your mind is caught up in longing and loathing, leaning toward or away from something, don't try to stop it from leaning. As we've seen, trying to make a leaning mind stop leaning is just another form of leaning. I really want not to have a leaning mind. Just be aware when your mind is leaning and realize what the leaning of mind actually is. With practice and attention to this moment, your mind will, of its own accord, lean less. As a leaf lands in the yard, so your mind will straighten up in a most natural way, and accord with mind itself, that is, the whole. To see doesn't mean to initiate a program of inaction. People often misunderstand this. To act or not to act is not the question. The question is whether or not we're awake. What we have to do is see what's happening in each moment, and base our actions on what we see, not on what we think. As Wang Po said, the foolish reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see. When we actually see what's happening, when we see the natural order of things, how things are interconnected, and how events unfold, we'll cease to act in defiance of reality. Forget yourself. See how your mind is leaning. What sustains us is already in place. We need only stop living in painful ignorance of it. Forget these words and start noticing if your mind is leaning, showing preferences, making calculations, trying to bring about, trying to push away. Liberation of mind doesn't result by acting out of a desire to be right or to do good. That's just another road to dukkha. Our actions must instead come only out of the desire to be awake. Our life is like a wheel out of kilter. It's not satisfying. There's something out there I've got to get, and there's something else out there I've got to keep away from me. This is bondage, this wanting, leaning, craving for something outside ourselves. It comes from that illusory vision of seeing ourselves as separate and real. The only choice we have in life is whether or not to be awake. Our job is to see when things don't make sense, when things aren't working out, where life is utterly baffling. We must note what a profound ache in the heart we feel and realize what it is we don't know. We must see our ignorance and confusion. There isn't anything out there that ultimately satisfies. There isn't anything out there that we must acquire or repel. In fact, there isn't any out there at all. Nothing enters or leaves the mind. Once we realize what actually goes on in a leaning mind, we'll no longer crave what had great attraction for us in our ignorance. We'll refrain from plunging ourselves into dukkha with the same natural ease that we refrain from putting our hand into a burning flame. We will no longer do what we can see will be painful. When your mind is not leaning, it's none other than whole mind. Attend to immediate experience, cultivate your mind in meditation, become familiar with the workings and meanings of your own mind. You'll be spared a great deal of misery, and ultimately you'll know true freedom. Open your wisdom eye, and just see whole mind. As his death approached, the Buddha said to those who were gathered around him, "Be a light unto yourself. Betake yourselves to no external refuge. Hold fast to the truth. Look not for refuge to anyone besides yourselves." You'll not find what satisfies the heart-mind in a book or in a teaching. You'll not find it even in what the Buddha taught. You won't get truth from the Buddha, or from a venerated Zen master or lama, or from a priest or monk or nun or teacher or guru. You won't receive truth, what quiets the deepest ache of the heart, from any other. The only way to see truth is by noticing if your mind is leaning. If your mind leans, it's because you see something out there apart from yourself. It's becoming lost in thought and imagination. It's being removed from immediate experience. Notice what your mind is actually doing now. You don't have to seek to do this. You're already fully equipped. You don't have to go anywhere or do anything special. Simply make just seeing your intention, that's all. To awaken is not to hold the idea of awakening. You can't practice waking up, and you can't fake it or imitate it. You have to actually want to wake up. You're the one you can count on. You're not other-dependent. Everything you need is here now. Just rely on thus, immediate, direct experience. You're the final authority. Whether you awaken or not is completely up to you.